The opportunity seems so elusive that there are zero openings made available to them. But we must also notice there are a specific number of positions allocated to categories of SC, ST, and OBC, with subcategorization within that. And that's only for this. So they can only, that implicitly means they can only compete among others within the same category for only the subset of seats allocated to them. So my question really was, how did these categories come about and what do they mean? Why is the government issuing certificates of backwardness based on lineage? Think about what that feels like. If I had to get one of those certificates, it would reinforce feelings of inferiority. It would perpetuate stereotypes. It would be deeply demeaning to me. That's how I would experience it. And the existence of such an official classification known as backwardness, uh, to me, it underscores that there's something wrong with the system. Something feels off. So that realization prompted a deep dive into the labyrinth of our nation's bureaucratic systems. And it was a quest for me to unravel the mysteries of caste categorization and understanding its profound impact on our societal fabric. So we've heard numerous calls for quote unquote annihilation of caste, both before and after independence. This has not happened. Instead, caste has become firmly rooted in the political, policy, social, and electoral discourse of independent India. But there is still a stubborn and anti intellectual resistance, maybe even driven by ulterior motives, to explore and comprehend the disparities between the Varna Jati complex and the caste tribe classifications that we have today. And this hampers our ability to understand contemporary social issues. So, the aim of this discussion, and I'm hoping it's a discussion where you can ask me questions in between and we can engage. So the aim of this discussion is not to offer an excuse for casteism or discrimination based on caste, whether that's in a historical context or in contemporary society. But the idea is to explore the origins and evolution of the system of categorization as it exists today. So we must analyze the past within its own context, not to justify or romanticize it, but to prevent mischaracterizations influenced by present day perspectives. This method is more likely to yield solutions that are innovative and feasible, grounded in the actual culture of this region, rather than blindly adhering to the prevailing model, which has only exacerbated the caste dialogue to the disadvantage of Hindu society. So today, I am compelled to take you on a journey, whether you are reserved, unreserved, you are still my fellow citizen, and you have a stake in this journey as much as I do, because there are matters that affect each and every one of us, and this is one of those. Regardless of which bureaucratic caste category the government puts us in, we all have a stake in this. So the first step in this unlikely journey is to the Iberian Peninsula in medieval times. So the Iberian Peninsula, this is the Iberian Peninsula in medieval times. And as you can see, much of it is Spain and Portugal. They were under Islamic rule for the best part of 800 years until that point. The last Muslim kingdom there was the Kingdom of Granada, which fell to Christian kingdoms Aragon and Castile in 1492. And when that happened, Jews and Muslims in the Iberian Peninsula were faced with the choice of conversion to Christianity or expulsion. As many Jews and Muslims opted for conversion to Christianity to avoid expulsion, a significant number of them chose to remain in Iberia, while others ventured beyond its borders, seeking refuge in distant lands. Among these converts were individuals who journeyed as far as Kerala, a region on the southwestern coast of India, as we know. One such notable figure was a Jew who served as a translator for the renowned explorer Vasco da Gama during his historic voyage to India in 1498. This individual's presence in Kerala highlights the far reaching consequences of religious conversion and the interconnectedness of global events during the Age of Discovery. So that is why I'm starting the story here, because it is relevant to the story of caste. And I will come to how that is in some time. So the mass conversions of Jews and Muslims presented a dilemma for the clergy and the authorities of the Spanish Inquisition, because they had no reliable means of distinguishing between genuine converts and those who feigned adherence to Christianity. So the church had the challenge of maintaining religious orthodoxy and purity among the newly converted Christians. So they set up what is called the Spanish Inquisition in response to this predicament. It was instituted as a means of enforcing religious conformity and rooting out heresy and dissent. The Inquisition is infamous for the severity of its tortures and its persecution of Jews and Muslims, leading to several thousand deaths. Under the auspices of this Inquisition, society was effectively divided into three distinct groups. First, there were the bloods, or the aristocrats. They could trace their lineage back to old Christian families of pure blood. Then there were the old Christians, who were descendants of generations of Christians and deemed untainted by Jewish or Muslim ancestry. And then there are the new Christians, comprising recent converts whose sincerity and loyalty to Christianity was often called into question. This hierarchical system, known as the Systema de Castas, or Society of Castes, derived from the Latin word castus, meaning purity or lineage. Through the Inquisition, the church and the state collaborated to maintain social order and religious orthodoxy, reinforcing the dominance of the ruling elite and perpetuating social divisions based on ancestry and religious affiliation. With the support of the Spanish monarchy, the Sistema de Castas took root in colonial Latin America, perpetuating notions of racial superiority and hierarchy. One aspect of this system was the role of the Catholic Church, who played a central role in enforcing and perpetuating the caste-based social hierarchy. The sixth included a papal bull or a decree called Inter Cetera, in which he authorized Spain and Portugal to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as subjects. The decree asserts that the Spain and Portugal to colonize, convert, and enslave. It also justified the enslavement of Africans. This facilitated the imposition of the Sistema de Castas in the Americas. Furthermore, the church emerged as a major landholder in colonial Latin America. So when they acquired land, they had these vast estates and plantations, and to support their economic interests and expand agricultural production, they needed more labor, and that is what led to widespread use of African slaves to work the land. And the introduction of African slaves into the caste system further entrenched social divisions, with slaves relegated to the lowest rung of the social hierarchy. So that is what you're seeing here. So in this slide, this is the caste system in Latin America, which consisted of various groups. First is the Peninsulars. These are Europeans born in Europe, occupying the highest echelons of society and enjoying privileges and opportunities denied to others. And there are the Creoles, Europeans born in the Americas, who often hold positions of power and influence, but were considered inferior to Peninsulars. And then there's the mestizos, the individuals of mixed European and indigenous parentage. They occupy an intermediate position in the social hierarchy. Then there are Indios, where there are two categories. There are Indios with reason and Indios without reason. Indios with reason are converted indigenous people who embrace Christianity. So they have limited rights and limited privileges. Indios without reason are indigenous people who are there to their native religions. So they were subject to discriminatory taxation practices, similar to the jizya tax in India. Then, of course, finally, there are the Negroes, who are African slaves. So they were treated as chattel property, they were denied of rights, they were subjected to harsh exploitation and oppression. The caste system in colonial Latin America was characterized by rigid social divisions enforced through legal and institutional mechanisms. There were, in fact, even caste wars, such as the Yucatan caste wars of the 1850s. And they were manifestations of resistance to this oppressive system, as marginalized groups sought to challenge and overturn the entrenched hierarchy. That is what led to these wars. So as we journey through the annals of history, what we're seeing is that there were caste systems in other places, and that is where this concept originated. So how does that relate to the Indian subcontinent? Well, in the Indian subcontinent, we've had British colonization for roughly about 190 years in different parts of the country. It might be different lengths of time. And British colonialism left an indelible mark on the social fabric of the region by conflating the concepts of jati and varna with the approximation of caste applied through the lens of European history that we just talked about. So the modern understanding of the terms caste and tribe in all of our laws, as present in government institutions, academic circles, public discussions, it owes much to the influence of colonial administrators and missionaries who applied these conceptual frameworks. So these terms emerged as bureaucratic categories designed by the colonial administrative apparatus on the basis of ethnography prepared by Christian missionaries, as well as researchers appointed by the British. The issue lies in defining tribe as a classification for groups that could not be easily categorized within the so-called caste system. Drawing from colonial experiences with indigenous populations in other parts of the world, the concept of quote unquote tribal identity was imposed by colonizers to categorize quote unquote indigenous communities, assuming them to be ethnically distinct original inhabitants who were subjugated and marginalized by the followers of the caste system. Thus, race was used to differentiate between various communities or groups within the same system, as well as to distinguish castes from tribes. In Indian society, as we know, the concept of jati encompassed a multitude of social factors. It could include clan affiliations, social class, descent, linguistic and dialectical backgrounds, lineage, regional origins, religious affiliations, and of course, traditional occupations. While some jatis identified primarily with a specific occupational group, the members within the jatis often pursued diverse livelihoods. Similarly, certain jatis shared common rituals, ancestry, or lineage, yet exhibited diversity in terms of traditional and contemporary occupations, geographical locations, the languages they speak, and other aspects. And practices like endogamy, where individuals marry within their own social group, varied across different jatis and were influenced by various social markers. So the boundaries between and among jatis were not always clearly defined or easily discernible. People belonging to purportedly marginalized jatis did not necessarily even recognize the supposed superiority of others over them. The social status of a jati varied significantly between regions, and it underwent changes when the entire jati relocated from one area to another. In a sense, the Indian subcontinent was home to thousands of jatis across different religions, and their norms were not dictated primarily by sacred texts or written social codes. Rather, these norms were traditionally transmitted through oral traditions and customs, resulting in a complex and fluid local hierarchy. On the contrary, Varna can be linked to documented guidelines as Hindu scriptures extensively discuss the concept, albeit not as an oppressive system. According to the Vedas, there are four Varnas identifiable across societal structures. This typology posits the existence of Brahmins who are inclined towards knowledge pursuit and spiritual growth, Kshatriyas responsible for governance and societal protection, Vaishyas involved in economic activity and wealth creation, and Shudras who perform essential labor for civilization's functioning. Varna serves as a framework for understanding human diversity and individual purpose, aligned with one's predominant nature. Both Varna and Jati have constituted aspects of social identity throughout history, with neither fully aligning with the modern notion of caste. In fact, there is no direct equivalent for the term caste in any Indian language. Do you know when the word was first used in the Indian context? It was by a Portuguese official, Duarte Barbosa, in the 16th century, who used the word casta during his stay in the Vijayanagara Empire. Portugal was the first European nation to establish a colony in India, a few years after Vasco da Gama arrived in Calicut in 1498. So the field of Indology as it exists today, it has its roots in Christian missionary endeavors. Missionaries found it crucial to comprehend the social landscape of India in order to effectively convert the local population to Christianity, which they viewed as the true religion. So early Catholic narratives recounting interactions with Hindus and their religious practices reflect prevalent anti-Semitic and anti-heathen sentiments. In the 16th century, Francis Xavier asserted that Hindus were under the sway of Brahmins who were allied with malevolent spirits, and eradicating Brahminism was the foremost objective in the mission to bring salvation to the suffering pagans of India. Xavier fervently advocated and practiced the use of force in this endeavor, although the Portuguese government often couldn't provide the troops that he requested. Nonetheless, Xavier's efforts were considerable, and he expressed satisfaction at witnessing the destruction of idols and temples. Within Portuguese territories, the persecution of Hindus and Hinduism particularly targeted Brahmins. Treaties with Hindu rulers specifically forbade the killing of Brahmins by the Portuguese. However, the physical persecution of Brahmins paled in comparison with the systematic, ideological, and propagandistic assault on quote unquote Brahminism, which has influenced the perceptions of many beyond the missionary circle today. Indeed, aside from anti Semitism, the anti Brahmin campaign initiated by missionaries stands as one of the most significant vilification campaigns in history. While the Portuguese missionary establishment unanimously viewed Brahmins as the primary impediment to India's salvation, there was disagreement regarding the methods to be employed against them. So, Robert D. Nobili advocated for deception rather than coercion. He disguised himself as a Brahmin and taught what he called the Yeshur Veda, a purported fifth Veda preserved by a community of Romaka Brahmins. Though he attracted some followers, his infiltration movement dwindled after his death. Recently, he's been canonized as the patron saint of inculturation theology, and his method is being implemented and refined in what are called Christian ashrams. Sorry. D. Nobili's approach was one facet of the Jesuits' broader strategy, which aimed to convert the elite with the expectation that they would influence the masses. So this tactic had previously been attempted in China, in Japan, at the Mughal court, with limited success until recent times in South Korea, where it has been spectacularly successful. Practically, the strategy necessitated presenting Christianity as a noble and exclusive religion, a notion that resonated with the Jesuits' identity as an elite order. This phase of missionary activity did not embrace populist or democratic rhetoric of equality. Political equality was not a prominent concern at that time, and even when it became a significant issue in the 18th and 19th centuries, the church vehemently opposed it and supported the aristocratic ancient regime. Only in the late 19th century, with the rise of atheist socialism and the attrition of urban masses from Christianity, did the church formulate social teachings like Rerum Novarum, which addressed the problems created by the Industrial Revolution, such as the rights and duties of capital and labor. Before then, the church's opposition to the Varna Jati system and to Brahmins had little to do with the commitment to social equality. For missionaries, the issue with Jati was simple. It lay in its provision of communal unity, social stability, and a sense of pride in one's Jati affiliation, according to their own writings. While missionary rhetoric often portrays Jati as a system of exclusion, they wrote that it fundamentally served as a source of belonging. They acknowledged that even for the Jatis with the lowest social cachet, the benefits of Jati membership, such as social cohesion, outweighed the humiliation they faced from other Jatis. This cohesion within Jatis played a crucial role in the endurance of Hinduism. Missionaries discovered that individuals were reluctant to relinquish their Jati identities when converting to Christianity, as it entailed abandoning various Jati customs. Therefore, the only effective method of conversion was to target entire Jati groups and allow them to retain certain aspects of their Jati identity. Hence, instead of eradicating Jati distinctions, the church permitted their continuation even within its own organizational framework. Pope Gregory the 15th officially endorsed Jati divisions within the Indian church, affirming earlier rulings by the local church hierarchy in 1599 and 1606. Similarly, there were Protestant testimonies about Indian society, and they also exhibited anti Semitic and anti heathen biases, along with anti Catholic biases, particularly concerning the priesthood. Various disciplines of race science, such as phrenology and anthropometry, arose to provide empirical validation for these theories of non European racial inferiority. So, these fields involved the collection of data on factors such as skin color, skull morphology and size, nasal shape and dimensions, and other bodily measurements. Such data purportedly facilitated assessments regarding evolutionary development, intellectual capacity, character traits, and social standing. So you can screen here, James Hunt, the founder of the Anthropological Society of London, said in 1860, we must not shrink from the candid avowal of what we believe to be the real place in nature or in society of the African or any other race. It will be the duty of conscientious anatomists carefully to record all deviations from the human standard of organization and analogy with inferior types, which are frequently manifested in the Negro race. Future generations will thank us more for the establishment of good, reliable facts than any haphazard speculations. So, in their quest to assert European superiority and understand the perceived inferiority of Indians and other colonized peoples, Europeans also selectively translated and interpreted Hindu texts through the lens of their own prejudices, thereby reinforcing their preconceived notions. So, British colonial administrators, seeking insights into Hindu society for governance purposes, sought parallels to Abrahamic laws within Hindu scriptures. However, their interpretations of philosophical and abstract concepts from these texts were often skewed by their own existing racial and religious biases, rather than being grounded in the lived customs or traditional religious perspectives of the Indian populace. So these British colonial administrators theorized that Indian social organizations adhered strictly to a fourfold caste system, with a marginalized class of quote unquote untouchables existing outside this structure. According to these theories, this hierarchical system was established and enforced by a dominant Hindu priestly class of what Europeans considered to be false religions, perpetuating oppression with little resistance from the populace over countless generations. Thus, the notion of a rigid pan India religiously mandated caste system, characterized by its perceived immutability, its passive nature, its hereditary structure, stems from European interpretations of Indian society and Hinduism, despite encountering realities on the ground that contradicted this notion. Inherent in these beliefs was a racialized hypothesis regarding the four castes, positing that the upper castes comprised fair skinned, supposedly more advanced Caucasians or Indo Europeans originating from a superior civilization. According to this theory, these groups, upon invading the Indian subcontinent, subjugated the indigenous, perceived as inferior, dark skinned populace, relegating them to the lower castes and outcasts. The term caste system has evolved since to describe a social hierarchy perceived as oppressive, entrenched in Indian society from ancient times, and sustained by the authority of Hinduism. Calling it a system suggests a uniform imposition of order across society based on a decree or a similar directive. This contrasts with the understanding of traditional and contemporary international scholars regarding the role of the Dharma Shastras in upholding social order, which primarily involved formalizing the equilibrium achieved by society after extensive experimentation and provided a consistent framework for rulers to administer justice. Despite persistent efforts by Indologists and Orientalists, the task of providing religious endorsement of caste discrimination within Hinduism remains unresolved. The selective focus on Manusmriti as the primary source of Hindu law, disregarding the multitude of Dharma Sutras, only around 4 of which remain extant, appears driven by the sensationalism of a few isolated verses. These verses are often quoted out of context, distorting their intended meaning. Additionally, the existence of contradictions between different Dharma Sutras has been largely overlooked in mainstream scholarly discourse. And although their theory lacked substantiation from archaeological or textual sources, it gained traction throughout Europe, fueling the emergence of increasingly racist ideologies that bolstered assertions of white European supremacy. In their expanding network of missionary schools, Indian pupils were taught a version of history that aligned with the missionaries' views, particularly regarding caste. Many internalized this biased narrative, including notable figures like Jyotirao Phule from Maharashtra, often hailed as the first modern leader to be called Mahatma. While Phule's stance wasn't outright anti Hindu, it strongly opposed Brahmins. Phule asserted that the Brahmin's inherent nature was troublesome and contentious, a trait so deeply ingrained that it could never be eliminated. The cornerstone of the anti Brahmin narrative in Indian history was the Aryan invasion theory. Phule's book, Slavery, begins with this historical perspective, contending that recent research has debunked the notion of Brahmins being indigenous to India. Instead, Aryans were portrayed as aggressive conquerors, characterized by their high self regard, cunningness, arrogance, and bigotry. Gopal Baba Valankar extended Phule's version of this racial theory and claimed that high caste people from the south were Australian Semitic non Aryans and African Negroes, that Chitpavan Brahmins were Barbary Jews, and that high caste Marathas' forebears were Turks. Phule argued that progress for the lower castes was impossible without taking drastic anti-Brahmin measures. So he advocated for the establishment of schools for Shudras in every village, but insisted on excluding Brahmin schoolmasters. This sentiment aligned perfectly with the agenda of the missionary school builders who sought to propagate anti-Brahmin sentiment. Through Phule, the missionary education system significantly influenced the leaders of the 20th century anti-Brahmin movement. In fact, even the term Dalit is a neologism coined by Phule. When the Hunter Commission, presided by Sir William Hunter, was appointed in the year 1882, Foley and Hunter first conceived the idea of introducing caste-based reservation in India. And even within the ranks of those advocating for Hindu interests, anti-Brahmin sentiments gained wide traction. The Arya Samaj movement, a Hindu reform movement, staunchly opposed what they called Brahminism, considering it contrary to Vedic principles, along with practices like idol worship and the caste system. Temples associated with Brahmins faced desecration in the name of Hinduism, while Orthodox Brahmins were vilified as betrayers of Hindu interests. This wellspring of anti-Brahminism is doubtless the Christian missionaries is designed to rope in the souls of Hindus. The establishment of the Trankebar mission in 1706, also known as the Royal Danish Mission, marked a significant milestone in missionary history. So it was initiated by a man named Bartholomeus Ziegenbalg, and he was a German Lutheran missionary under the patronage of King Frederick IV of Denmark. The mission was aimed to spread Protestant Christianity in Trankebar, which is basically present-day Tamil Nadu. Supported by a group of 48 missionaries, predominantly German Lutherans, the mission strategies integral to Protestant missionary efforts, including Bible translation into Indian languages, distribution of printed tracts, and the establishment of schools. Despite its missionary zeal, the Danish Protestant mission maintained caste distinctions among converts from Hinduism, a practice prevalent among Protestant missions across India until the 1820s. So Ziegenbalg, the founder of the Trankebar mission, played a crucial role in shaping the missionary perspective on religion in the South. His works, particularly Malabarian heathenism in 1711 and the genealogy of Malabarian gods in 1713, contributed to the development of the theory of a Dravidian people with an identity separate from the Aryan North. In spite of his acquaintance with Sanskrit and Sanatan Dharma, Ziegenbalg's exposure to Tamil religious texts in the libraries of non-Brahmin Shaivite Adinams led him to perceive the Tamil religion as separate from the Brahminical or Vedic religion prevalent in the north. This early viewpoint from the missionary sphere suggested that Tamil Saivism was unrelated to Sanatan Dharma, a notion that persists today among contemporary Dravidianists. Between Ziegenbalg's untimely death in 1719 and the arrival of Lutheran missionaries from the Leipzig Missionary Society, notably Karl Grohl as mission director in Trankebar in 1844, another missionary, the French Catholic, the Abbé Jean-Antoine Dubois, significantly contributed to the understanding of caste. So Dubois had this extensive work called the Description of the Character, Manners, and Customs of the Peoples of India and of their institutions, religious and civil. This was the earliest and most influential European account of caste, blending textual analysis with empirical observation in the early 19th century. Much of Dubois' work was built upon an earlier effort by Gaston Laurent Cordoue, a French Jesuit missionary based in Pondicherry, known for his French Telugu Sanskrit dictionary. Cordo's discussions with fellow French Indologists in the 1760s regarded the linguistic similarities between Sanskrit, Latin, Greek, German, and Russian were later presented by Abbé Dubois as his own work to Mark Wilkes, the British resident in Mysore, in 1806. This manuscript was eventually acquired by the Madras government for 2,000 star pagodas, the currency used by the British East India Company until 1816. Subsequently, Dubois' work was translated from French to English and officially published in 1816. Dubois at one point had written, "There is no stronghold of evil so impregnable as Brahmins." William Bentinck, who served as the governor of Madras at that time, acknowledged the value of Dubois' work in gaining insights into the customs and manners of the Hindus. This publication would shape the British East India Company's understanding of Hindu society and influence its administrative and social policies, particularly in Madras, for over 50 years. Reverend Norman MacLeod, who approved of Dubois' writings, wrote in 1871, "The Brahmin is therefore well worth looking at. We have more to do with him than the Tsar of all the Russians. The battle we have to fight with him is not against guns or rifles, not against flesh or blood." From there onwards, it spread to the entire English educated class and ultimately became an unquestionable dogma in India's political parlance. Over time, European theories regarding Hindus and Hinduism were integrated into the official administration of British colonial rule through a series of censuses and policy implementations. From the 1870s to the 1930s, various censuses were conducted to categorize the Indian populace into four castes. The 1872 and 1881 censuses attempted to classify people fundamentally according to the Varna mentioned in ancient texts. The broad caste basing proved not to reflect the realities of social relationships. It also did not apply throughout the country. Furthermore, as Ibetson and others in the Punjab realized after 1872, it had no practical purpose from an administrative point of view. In 1881, Punjab abandoned the primary categorization by Varna that was used in other British Indian jurisdictions in that year and preferred instead to assign more weight to the category of occupation. In 1891, the other jurisdictions also followed suit. Attempts continued to recognize the broad socio-economic implications of the Varna system, but they were also applied inconsistently. William Chisholm Plowden, the commissioner in 1881, designated categories of Brahmins, Rajputs, castes of good social position, inferior castes, and non-Hindus or aboriginal castes. In 1921, the category of depressed classes was used, and in 1931, the nomenclature became exterior classes. British officials acknowledged that their conceptualizations of Indian society did not align with the actual experiences and realities of Indian people, and yet they chose to impose this notion upon the Indians. Motivation behind this imposition becomes evident in Reverend Joseph Roberts' speech in Madras on January 4th, 1844, where he noted that, quote, next to the love of sin, caste, referring to the Varna Jati system, is the great barrier in India betwixt the pagans and Christ, end quote. Following India's first war of independence in 1857, which posed a threat to British rule, colonial authorities sought to create structural divisions within Indian society. Establishing a vertical social structure was perceived as a strategic and effective means to maintain control. Herbert Risley, the star of our talk, a young bureaucrat with interests in social anthropology, linguistics, and anthropometry, emerged as a suitable candidate to implement this strategy. If India's prevailing perception in the Western world today revolves around its caste divisions and societal fractures, much of the responsibility can be attributed to these censuses and specifically to Risley. As an imperialist and British colonial administrator, Risley wielded significant influence over India through his work in ethnography and census management during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. His endeavors played a pivotal role in shaping the understanding and classification of Indian society, particularly concerning caste and race. A defining moment in Risley's impact was his leadership in orchestrating the 1901 Census of India and the subsequent publication, The People of India, in 1908. Here, he fundamentally reorganized Indian society along caste lines, tracing its origins to interactions between invading Indo-Aryans and the native Dravidians. This was the Risleyan Revolution, the subject of this talk. It was revolutionary in its impact on Indian society. His systematic classifications, particularly regarding caste and tribe, have left an enduring mark on the comprehension of social structures in India and led to a fabricated restructuring of Hindu society according to European interpretations. Differently, the process of quote-unquote castifying the existing Varna Jati system led to a distorted portrayal of its operation, including its structure, inflexibility, and the extent of atrocities stemming from so-called caste consciousness. Despite critiques and attempts to discredit Risley's theories, they persist in contemporary Indian discourse. The caste-based divisions introduced by Risley endure, and they shape political affiliations, social dynamics, and access to benefits. The rigid hierarchies of his taxonomies present challenges to social mobility. The alignment of political parties with specific castes and the competition for affirmative action benefits serve as reminders of the lasting impact of Risley's legacy. So this was the Risleyan Revolution, the subject of this talk. It was revolutionary in its impact on Indian society and politics. His systematic classifications, particularly regarding caste and tribe, have left an enduring mark on the comprehension of social structures in India and led to a fabricated restructuring of Hindu society according to European interpretations. Put differently, this process of quote-unquote castifying the existing Varna Jati system led to the distorted portrayal of its operation, including its structure, its inflexibility, and the extent of atrocities stemming from so-called caste consciousness. Despite critiques and attempts to discredit Risley's theories, they persist in contemporary Indian discourse. This caste-based division that was introduced by Risley endures, and it shapes political affiliations, it shapes social dynamics, and it shapes access to benefits. The rigid hierarchies of his taxonomies present challenges to social mobility, the alignment of political parties with specific castes, and the competition for affirmative action benefits serve as reminders of the lasting impact of Risley's legacy. Risley started his career with the British Raj in 1873, serving as assistant magistrate and assistant district collector in Midnapur, Bengal. This region was inhabited by forest tribes, sparking Risley's enduring interest in studying anthropology, particularly focusing on these tribes. Concurrently, he participated in William Wilson Hunter's Statistical Survey of India, initiated in 1869, and eventually published in the first edition of the Imperial Gazetteer of India in 1881. Risley notably contributed to compiling the survey's volume for the hill districts of Bengal. In 1885, Risley was tasked with conducting an ethnographic survey of Bengal, reflecting the colonial government's recognition of the necessity for a deeper understanding of its subjects. Denzel Ibbetson, a senior British administrator at the time, highlighted the need, stating, quote, "Our ignorance of the customs and beliefs of the people among whom we dwell is surely, in some respects, a reproach to us." Over the subsequent 5 years, Risley and his team, comprising administrators, missionaries, and local Indians, meticulously studied and categorized the population based on various characteristics, with caste being deemed the most significant. Risley viewed India as an ethnological laboratory, asserting that the practice of endogamy had rigidly delineated communities by caste, equating caste to race. His findings were published in 1891 in 4 volumes titled The Tribes and Castes of Bengal, presenting ethnographic and anthropometric data. So the term caste, imported from Europe to describe the Varna Jati system, facilitated Risley's task of social classification by applying European social frameworks, particularly prevalent race theories, to the Indian context. Risley was a key proponent of the notion that Indian civilization's genesis lay in the clash between invading fair-skinned, civilized Sanskrit-speaking Aryans and dark-skinned, uncivilized Aborigines. This theory, known as scientific racism, dominated scholarly discourse for about a century, from the 1840s until the 1940s. It posited that race determined human attitudes, capabilities, and historical trajectories. These racial ideologies later served as a rationale not only for European imperialist endeavors across the globe, but also for Adolf Hitler and his aspirations for cultivating a master race. Inspired by these ideas, Risley aimed to develop a standardized method of classifying diverse Indian communities. One such method was the nasal index, a measure of nasal width relative to height, chosen to distinguish between racial or ethnic groups. Influenced by Max Muller's work, Risley searched for physical features in the Vedas to differentiate Aryans from Dravidians, interpreting nose length as one such distinguishing trait based on sparse textual references. So the nasal index becomes a tool of race science akin to phrenology, categorizing Indian communities. In The People of India, written in 1908, Risley attributed the caste system's origins to interactions between the Indo-Aryan invaders and native Dravidians. According to his theory, strict hypergamy among Indo-Aryan men and Dravidian women preserved racial distinctions, leading to the development of the caste system to prevent miscegenation. Risley's primary objective was to differentiate Aryan from the non-Aryan communities and classify non-Aryan groups as distinct from mainstream Hindu society. Despite lacking Sanskrit expertise and relying solely on Muller's interpretations, he falsely stated that the Vedas had frequent references to the noses of the people whom the Aryans found in possession of the plains, suggesting that nobody who glanced at the Vedas missed such accounts. In addition to the Aryan Dravidian theory, Risley expanded the application of the nasal index, suggesting that variations within Indian races reflected positions within the caste system. So he posited that the social position of a caste varies inversely as its nasal index, indicating a correlation between nasal features and caste status. Risley also linked the nasal index to the distinction between tribes and Hindu castes, arguing that caste origins were rooted in race rather than occupation. Risley's conclusions about the racial origins of castes or tribal groups were based on a sample size as small as 100 and in many cases as few as 30 individuals. Risley likely had a preconceived notion of the conclusions he wanted to reach and worked to reshape a complex racial typology with a minimal number of observations. So then we see this map. This is the northwest provinces. It partly corresponds to today's UP. In the colonial use of caste in census taking commenced with the 1865 census of the northwest provinces. And this process encountered significant issues of identification and categorization. The caste tables utilized in these censuses varied across regions, comprising a mixture of varnas, occupations, and cultural affiliations. For instance, the 1871 census of the Northwest provinces included categories like scribes, small traders, servants, and laborers, alongside traditional varnas such as Brahmins, Rajputs, and Baniyas. In 1901, Risley assumed the position of Director of Ethnography and Census Commissioner of India. The 1901 census adopted Risley's anthropological concepts and data to delineate castes. However, his classification system encountered similar inconsistencies to his predecessors in resolving the discrepancies in caste identification. Despite these discrepancies in the colonial bureaucracy persisted in fitting the entire Indian population into these arbitrary categories. So if an individual did not fit into the existing taxonomy, new categories were invented on the spot. Despite public protests regarding improper caste assignments, the colonial machinery continued its efforts with little regard for public sentiment. So Susan Bailey, professor emeritus of historical anthropology at Cambridge University, observed that the colonial census ranked, standardized, and cross-referenced jati listings for Indians on principles similar to zoology and botanical classifications, aiming to establish hierarchical superiority based on supposed purity, occupational origins, and collective moral worth. In his 1903 report, Risley himself acknowledged that castes can only be classified based on social precedents. No classification scheme can encompass the entirety of India. Risley passed away in 1911, yet the practice of incorporating caste into colonial censuses persisted until 1931, when it was finally abandoned due to the logistical challenges and political pressures. Ironically, while colonial bureaucrats continued to produce extensive reports detailing their zoological classification of the Indian population, some British officials criticized these endeavors as oversimplified representations of Indian social reality. M.L. Middleton, the superintendent of the government of India, wrote the following in the 1911 census. We pigeonholed everyone by castes, and if we could not find a true caste for them, we labeled them with the name of a hereditary occupation. We are largely responsible for the caste system which we deplore. He then went on to speculate what might have happened if the British had not extensively tinkered with the indigenous native system. Left to themselves, such castes would rapidly disappear and no one would suffer. The large number of people who have refused to record any caste at this census is a sign of progress and the breaking of customary bonds. The British government's passion for labels and pigeonholes has led to a crystallization of the caste system, which, except among the aristocratic castes, was really very fluid under indigenous rule. So Eurocentrism and colonial biases heavily influenced Risley's efforts to impose Western social frameworks onto India. Strong ethical concerns also arise regarding his classification methods. They reinforce racial stereotypes and discriminatory practices. The scientific racism and other theories relying on body measurement for evolutionary development, which Risley used in his classification methods, stand completely discredited today. Critics call into question the scientific integrity of Risley's work, particularly his dependence on Muller's Aryan invasion theory, which modern DNA studies have disputed. These studies suggest a gradual transmigration of people rather than a sudden invasion, undermining the foundation of Risley's research. Moreover, his neglect of environmental factors in shaping physical attributes and his use of small sample sizes to draw broad conclusions reveals an oversimplified and a deterministic approach to India's complex social dynamics. Risley's assumption that Indian populations were strictly endogamous, forbidden by social laws to intermarry across groups for centuries, has also been challenged by historical evidence. India's history does include instances of intermarriage between different groups, contradicting Risley's portrayal of rigid social boundaries and vertical parentage. Despite the widespread criticism directed at Risley's work, it's difficult to overlook the profound and enduring impact that he has had on Indian society. He effectively revolutionized the flexible Varna Jati system into a rigid caste hierarchy through his pseudoscientific classification methods, leaving a lasting impact that still influences social dynamics today. While the Aryan invasion theory promoted by Risley and his contemporaries has been strongly disputed, its remnants persist in contemporary politics, particularly evident in the divisive Dravidian politics of Tamil Nadu. This theory continues to be exploited for political gain, perpetuating social divisions. Risley's stereotyping also led to the contentious reservation system as we know it today. By the conclusion of Risley's revolution, Instead of the envisioned four castes, numerous castes or communities were enumerated, highlighting the complexity of Indian society. Some census officials attempted to rank these groups by social status, often relying on native informants who might have been influenced by power dynamics to provide information sought by the colonizers or to improve their own social standing. However, the lack of objective criteria for assigning status became evident as Hindus across the subcontinent started contesting the rankings assigned to them. Another means by which the British administrators categorized Indians was through a series of laws referred to as the Criminal Tribes Act as part of their divide and rule strategy and to aid Christian missionaries in their conversion efforts. Starting in 1871, this cruel law was initially implemented in northern India and later extended to Bengal and other provinces. It categorized 160 castes, which form the core of the present day quote unquote Dalit community, as hereditary criminals. These communities were labeled as criminals from birth with skills passed down through generations in activities such as theft, burglary, and robbery. The total population was around 60 million, comprising nearly 30% of the total Hindu population of India, which was about 200 million, according to the 1871 census. All members of these so called criminal tribes were native Hindus, and the British rulers condemned them as hereditary criminals, relegating them to a life of menial labor. Criminal Tribes Act sanctioned genocide against various Indian tribes in different regions, including the Bhils, the Kanjars, the Sansis, and others, branding them as criminals from birth. Many of these tribes were deprived of basic human rights, not because they were engaged in criminal activities, but because they resisted British efforts to destroy their forests and habitats. The thugs were one such tribe that courageously fought against British rule, but were vilified through propaganda, leading the term thug to become synonymous with criminality in English. Under the Criminal Tribes Act, the movement of these tribes was severely restricted, with males required to regularly report to local police stations. This hindered their ability to seek education or economic opportunities outside their villages, as district police superintendents closely monitored their movements on a daily basis. So the Criminal Tribes Act was introduced in 1871 by British jurist James Fitzjames Stephen, who is also known for authoring the Indian Evidence Act. He, in this bill, stripped these communities of basic human rights and dignity, severely hindering their socioeconomic advancement by limiting their freedom of movement. So this oppressive law was grounded in the unfounded belief that in India, certain communities were inherently destined to pursue specific occupations passed down through generations, leading to the assumption that there were also hereditary criminals within these communities. Stephen elaborated on this flawed logic by stating, and I quote, when we speak of professional criminals, we mean a tribe whose ancestors from time immemorial, destined by the usage of caste to commit crime, and whose descendants will be offenders against law until the whole tribe is exterminated in the manner of thugs, unquote. Thus, this oppressive law was built on irrational assumptions rather than empirical evidence. There was no effort to investigate the underlying causes that may have driven these vulnerable tribes to resort to criminal activities for survival, a situation that likely emerged during the prolonged period of Islamic rule in India. Fortunately, the British authorities did not actually heed Stephen's extreme suggestion of exterminating these marginalized communities. The Criminal Tribes Act was eventually repealed upon independence, and the listed communities comprising millions of people were decriminalized and then designated under scheduled castes and scheduled tribe categories. However, our history books do not talk about the Criminal Tribes Act or the abominable human rights violations inflicted under the Act by the British Raj. Despite documented biases and shortcomings, the theoretical framework of the four-tiered hierarchical caste system, including so-called untouchable castes, has persisted as the primary means of describing Indian society. By the 20th century, due to successive census exercises, government policies, and the influence of British education, much of the Indian population had internalized and adopted the colonial classification system into Indian law. In other words, the Risleyan revolution had succeeded, and it would now be carried forward by others. In South India, the British colonial authorities encouraged anti-Brahmin, anti-Hindi, and anti-North Indian sentiments through the establishment of the Dravidian Association in 1914, the South Indian People's Association in 1916, and the Justice Party in 1917. The Dravidian movement, which would become the flag bearer of the Risleyan Revolution in South India, has its origin in the idea of British Christian evangelist Robert Caldwell, whose statue has been installed in Chennai's Marina Beach since 1968. Bishop Caldwell established and propagated the concept of the Dravidian race identity with the intention of converting native Hindus to Christianity. His successor, Jiu Po, further secularized classical Tamil Hindu texts to align them with Christianity. The Justice Party later nurtured the ideas that were propagated by these two Christian missionaries. The term Dravida, of course, originally referred to the southern region of India and meant a land surrounded by water, Drava, on three sides. Rabindranath Tagore used the word Dravida in the national anthem to refer to South India. However, Robert Caldwell and G.U. Pope gave different meanings to the term Dravida and used it to develop the Dravida separatist theory, which opposed Sanskrit, and the Aryan invasion theory. According to their interpretation, the Tamil language was associated with the non-Brahmin community of Shudras in opposition to the Aryans of North India. The Justice Party rose at a time when, as part of their divide and rule policy, the British aimed to counter the influence of Brahmins by appointing non-Brahmins to government positions. Identity politics based on non-Brahmin status was stoked by the British with the aim of cultivating some groups that believed that British rule was more beneficial to them than an independent government led by the Congress would be. Accordingly, the Justice Party's ideology was rooted in the Non-Brahmin Manifesto that was published in 1916 by the South Indian People's Association. The manifesto pledged the loyalty of non-Brahmins to the British colonial government and rejected the national freedom movement and the Home Rule movement under Annie Besant. The manifesto was criticized by the Hindu, a nationalist newspaper, and the New Age, the Home Rule movement's newspaper. The Justice Party, like the Muslim League, was against the freedom struggle and opposed the idea of self-government and freedom from British rule. They openly supported British rule and did not believe in a united India. Both the founders of the Justice Party, T.M. Nair and P.T. Tyagaraja Chettiar, approved of the Rowlatt Act and the subsequent government action against the popular agitation at Jallianwala Bagh. In January 1919, during the deliberation of the Rowlatt legislation by the government of India, T.M. Nair questioned the reason for Montagu and Chelmsford to release their report when the findings of the Rowlatt Committee were already available. Tyagaraja Chetty commented on the publication of the Rowlatt report saying, quote, "To what community belong most of the people who find bad eminence in this report? Who is the central figure among them? He is none other than the Brahmin gentleman Tilak, who has been elected to the presidential chair of the next session of the Indian National Congress." Unquote. So the Justice Party's opposition to Brahmins and its anti-Brahmin attitude shaped many of its policies and ideas. On 16 September 1921, the first Justice Party government passed the first communal government order, GO number 6613, thereby becoming the first elected body in Indian legislative history to legislate reservation, although it was not implemented until years later under a different government. Before this, Chhatrapati Shahu, the ruler of the princely state of Kolhapur, had initiated a 50% reservation measure in 1902, favoring non-Brahmin and backward communities. The Imperial Parliament at Westminster had also introduced elements of reservation in the Government of India Act of 1909. Similarly, in 1918, responding to criticism of Brahmin dominance in administration, Raja Nalvadi Krishnaraja Vadiyar of Mysore established a committee to enforce reservation for non-Brahmins in government positions and education, despite opposition from his Diwan, M. Vishweshwaraya, who also resigned in protest. The Justice Party later came under E.V. Ramaswamy's control. You might know him as Periyar. Ramaswamy believed that in order to destroy Hinduism, Brahmins need to be opposed, isolated, excommunicated, and persecuted. He believed that opposing Brahmins was equivalent to opposing Hindus and vice versa. During the height of his movement, Ramaswamy emphasized that Brahmins were inherently unchangeable due to their birthright. In an interview, he was asked if he believed that Brahmins were unable to have honest intentions just by being born into their caste. Ramaswamy replied in the affirmative, stating that they were inherently incapable of honesty. Ramaswamy also asserted that Brahmins should be physically attacked and their homes should be burned. In an article published after independence in Vidudalai, the official newspaper of his party, Ramaswamy would go on to make a highly misogynistic claim, and I quote, "Had the British continued for another 10 years, more than half of the Brahmin women would have been ours, and the Tamils would have been their husbands, and the dominating caste would have been destroyed by more than half. Only after Brahmin women had started chasing our boys did the Brahmin men become very angry with the British." Clearly, Ramaswamy and his Dravidian movement were and remained strong foot soldiers of the Risleyan Revolution. In the pre-independence period, there were more efforts to further the Risleyan Revolution. In May 1928, a group of Indian political parties known as the All Parties Conference organized a committee to author the Constitution of India after independence would be actualized. A draft constitution known as the Nehru Report was adopted by the All Party Conference in Lucknow. It rejected completely all calls for separate electorates for any community. In the early 1930s, amidst growing demands for self-rule in India, the British government and Indian political leaders convened a series of peace conferences known as the Round Table Conferences. These conferences, held between November 1930 and December 1932, aimed to discuss constitutional reforms for India. The initiative for these conferences came from Muhammad Ali Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan, who proposed the idea to Viceroy Lord Irwin and Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, following the recommendations of the Simon Commission's report in May 1930. Among the prominent Indian figures who participated in these conferences were Bhimrao Ramji Ambedkar. Ambedkar had previously been called upon to provide testimony before the Southborough Committee tasked with drafting the Government of India Act 1919. During this session, Ambedkar had advocated for the establishment of separate electorates and reservation for untouchables and other religious groups. In 1920, with the support of the Shahu of Kolhapur, he launched the weekly publication Mukh Nayak in Mumbai. Subsequently, Ambedkar had pursued a career in law. In 1926, he successfully defended 3 non-Brahmin leaders who had accused the Brahmin community of ruining India, leading to a libel lawsuit against them. During a conference in late 1927, Ambedkar had symbolically burned copies of the Manusmriti, a classical Hindu text, for endorsing caste discrimination and quote-unquote untouchability. This was why Ambedkar had been chosen as one of the 2 representatives of the depressed classes at the Round Table conferences, along with Rettamalai Srinivasan. In his representation at the Roundtable conferences, Ambedkar presented a memorandum called Claims of Minority Communities. Based on Ambedkar's memorandum, the then Prime Minister of Britain, Ramsay MacDonald, proposed the communal award, according to which the depressed classes, roughly corresponding to the SCs and STs, were assigned a number of seats to be filled by elections from constituencies in which only they could vote, although they could also vote in other seats. Other depressed classes leaders like MC Raja were severely critical of the award, and in fact, Ambedkar was the only one propagating the division. Mahatma Gandhi strongly objected to the proposal, seeing it as another tactic by the cunning British to maintain social divisions and reinforce their tenuous control over the nation. He opposed the idea of labeling the so-called depressed classes as separate from Hindu society, arguing that granting them a separate electorate implied their exclusion from the Hindu community. I have to resist your decision with my life, he wrote to the then British PM, Ramsay MacDonald, on August 18th. What I am against is their statutory separation, even in a limited form, from the Hindu fold, he reiterated on September 9th. But the British refused to renege on their decision. To counter the communal award, Gandhi initiated a hunger strike while imprisoned on sedition charges at Yerwada Central Jail in Puna, India. Gandhi and the Congress Party were opposed to any form of separate electorates for the depressed classes, fearing it would weaken and divide Hindu society. He perceived the communal award as another instance of the British employing their divisive divide and rule strategy to maintain control over India. Other leaders from the depressed classes believed that Ambedkar was advocating solely for the interests of the Mahar community and not representing the broader depressed classes. Gandhi advocated for joint electorates with reservation, which would have resulted in more seats for the legislative councils. Ambedkar lacked a convincing response to this proposal. Instead, he often dismissed opposing leaders as paid agents of the Congress Party if they did not agree with this viewpoint. Gandhi's hunger strike eventually pressured Ambedkar to intervene and halt the fast. Consequently, on September 24, 1932, an agreement was reached between Gandhi and Ambedkar, ending the hunger strike. Ambedkar signed the pact representing the depressed classes, while Madan Mohan Malviya represented upper caste Hindus. This agreement tacitly acknowledged that the depressed classes face the most discrimination within Hindu society. It also recognized the necessity of providing concrete measures to enhance their political representation and afford them advantages to overcome their social and economic backwardness. According to the terms outlined in the Puna Pact, the allocation of seats reserved for the depressed classes in provincial councils varied based on the size of the provinces. For instance, Madras had 30 reserved seats, Punjab had 8, while Bombay and Sindh had 15 each. Similarly, the central provinces had 20 reserved seats, Bihar and Orissa had 18, and Bengal had 30. With United Provinces and Assam had 20 and 7 reserved seats, respectively, totaling the reserved seats for depressed classes at 148. In the central legislature, 19% of the seats were reserved for the depressed classes. Under the pact, eligible members of the depressed classes formed an electoral college which elected 4 candidates through a single vote. The 4 candidates with the highest number of votes constituted the panel of 4. Subsequently, these 4 candidates participated in the General Assembly elections alongside other candidates. Here, the general electorate cast their votes. This system effectively granted the depressed classes a double vote since they were part of the general electorate as well. The principle of joint electorate and reserved seats was also applied in the Central Assembly. It was agreed as per the terms of the pact to continue the system for 10 years unless mutually terminated earlier. Additionally, a portion of the educational grant was earmarked for the education of the depressed classes across all provinces. Further, the provision stipulated that there should be no discrimination against individuals belonging to the depressed classes in matters related to elections to local bodies or appointments to government services. The Puna Pact represented a clash between two contrasting worldviews. Gandhi's emphasis was on caste reform through social and spiritual means, and Ambedkar's insistence was on addressing caste as a political issue. Ambedkar's bitterness about the Puna Pact lingered till the very end. In an interview a year before his death, Ambedkar called Gandhi's stand during the Puna Pact negotiations a huge whim of a politician. As a politician, he was never a Mahatma. I refuse to call him Mahatma, Ambedkar said. In 1936, Ambedkar established the Independent Labour Party and participated in the 1937 Bombay elections for the Central Legislative Assembly. The party contested 13 reserved seats and 4 general seats, winning 11 and 3 seats respectively. On May 15, 1936, Ambedkar released his book, Annihilation of Caste. The book was a scathing critique of Hindu Orthodox religious leaders and the caste system. It also served as a rebuke of Gandhi's views on the subject. Ambedkar's stance in Annihilation of Caste echoed colonial and missionary rhetoric, portraying the upper castes, particularly Brahmins and Baniyas, as perpetual exploiters of the Shudras. Ambedkar presented himself to the British as the exclusive advocate for the depressed classes, akin to Jinnah's sole representation of Muslims. Despite his persistent efforts, though, the British consistently rejected his appeals. For Ambedkar, Hinduism represented oppression and subjugation of the weak and marginalized. He likened the anti-Semitism of the Nazis towards Jews to the discrimination practiced by Hindus against untouchables, emphasizing the ideological parallels. Throughout his writings and speeches, he emphasized the loyalty of untouchables to the British, attributing their support to the British victories in wars. He controversially claimed that scheduled castes had been instrumental in providing manpower to the East India Company, aiding in the conquest of India. He supported Jinnah's call for a day of deliverance on December 22nd, 1939, when Congress ministries resigned in protest against British involvement in World War II without consulting India. Ambedkar actively endorsed the nationwide celebrations of this event along with E.V. Ramaswamy. Ambedkar's role during the Quit India movement was marked by his appointment as the Minister of Labour in the British government just before the movement's commencement. Initially overlooked for the position, Ambedkar's persistent demands eventually led to his appointment. However, he faced criticism for his financial indebtedness, with allegations suggesting that his appointment was motivated by his inability to pay loans owed to certain individuals. During the Quit India movement, British authorities strategically employed leaders like Ambedkar, Aga Khan, and Jinnah to denounce Gandhi and the Congress. Despite being aware of the imminent confrontation between the British and the nationalist movement, these leaders aligned themselves with the Congress, disregarding the nationalist cause. The Quit India movement saw the arrest of Congress leaders and widespread atrocities inflicted by the British, resulting in thousands of deaths. Amid these events, Ambedkar remained steadfast in his support for the British government, even as Gandhi undertook a 21-day fast in protest while in jail. Throughout the independence movement, Ambedkar remained loyal to the British, advocating against nationalist sentiments. He asserted that India was not ready for independence until all its diverse communities united, echoing a sentiment often repeated by the British to justify their continued rule. Ambedkar's tenure as a Minister of Labour was marked by controversy, particularly regarding financial support provided to M.N. Roy, a vocal critic of Gandhi and the Congress. Despite facing scrutiny and questions about the allocation of funds, Ambedkar defended his actions, maintaining that the money was intended for the Indian Labour Federation. In his support of partition, Ambedkar cited concerns about Hindu-Muslim relations and the loyalty of Muslim soldiers in a united India. While some interpreted this stance as concern for Hindu interests, others like Arun Shourie have viewed it as a pragmatic decision that favored British interests in India. Ambedkar consistently expressed strong disapproval of Gandhi's attempts to eliminate untouchability. He alleged that Gandhi's efforts were either belated, ineffective, motivated by personal gain, or aimed at winning over the depressed classes through exaggerated kindness. Ambedkar steadfastly declined to participate in Gandhi's initiatives. Beyond Gandhi, he also criticized other leaders like MC Raja, alleging ulterior motives behind their actions. Ambedkar consistently echoed the British perspective that India was not yet ready for self rule. In 1946, Lord Wavell documented Ambedkar saying, if India became independent, it would be one of the greatest disasters that could happen. That same year, Ambedkar published a book titled Who Were the Shudras? Ambedkar writes in the preface of the book, and I quote, two questions are raised in this book. Who were the Shudras, and how did they come to be the fourth Varna of the Indian Indo-Aryan society? My answers to them are summarized below. 1. The Shudras were one of the Aryan communities of the solar race. There was a time when the Aryan society recognized only three Varnas, namely Brahmins, Kshatriyas, and Vaishyas. The Shudras did not form a separate Varna. They ranked as part of the Kshatriya Varna in Indo-Aryan society. There was a continuous feud between the Shudra kings and the Brahmins, in which Brahmins were subjected to many tyrannies and indignities. As a result of the negligence towards the Shudras generated by their tyrannies and oppressions, the Brahmins refused to perform the Upanayana of the Shudras. Owing to the denial of Upanayana, the Shudras who were Kshatriyas became socially degraded, fell below the rank of the Vaishyas, and thus came to form the fourth Varna. End quote. In reality, there is extensive inscriptional and literary evidence pointing towards the high status of Shudra communities in pre-colonial India. A compelling image of the proud self-image, a compelling glimpse of this proud self-image of the Shudras in our reading comes from Cynthia Talbot's commentary on society in Kakatiya, Andhra, in which she notes that Shudra families, not the Kshatriya lineages, possessed the greatest degree of actual political power in medieval Andhra despite their so-called humble ancestry. The Vishnu Smriti classifies the artisans as Shudra. They are called Shilpis. The Artha Shastra also emphatically qualifies the Shudras as artisans. On the other hand, the Parashara Smriti allows all the four Varnas to practice the crafts, and the Jatakas mentioned Brahmin carpenters. Notwithstanding the contradictions between these texts, which are often the result of differences in space and time of their applicability, it is safe to say that the status of a craft was a function of its proximity and utility to Vedic ritual, as well as the practitioner's social ambition and the utilitarian value of their products. The skill and mastery displayed by Shudra artisans significantly influenced their social standing. Stella Kramrisch, in her essay Traditions of the Indian Craftsman, illustrates this with the example of the Kamalar, artisans from South India. They challenged the dominance of Brahmins, asserting their equality by tracing their lineage back to the divine architect Vishwakarma's sons. This myth not only served as a means of self identification, but also instilled in artisans a sense of purpose to attain divine perfection through their craft. The modern decline of the Shudras began with the British takeover of temple control, turning these centers of economic activity into revenue sources for the colonizers. This was achieved through legal maneuvers reminiscent of the doctrine of lapse, similar to the annexation of indigenous lands by European invaders elsewhere in the world. Additionally, changes in land laws and taxation further contributed to this decline. The shift towards a focus on land yields and seasonal professions disrupted the traditional transfer of knowledge and skills, leading to a decline in secondary professions. This decline has stripped away a sense of meaning from them, leaving several of them with a permanent victim mentality. This sense of victimhood has been exploited by the government, which offers concessions and benefits in exchange for loyalty, effectively weaponizing caste identities. Thus, the depiction of the colonial Mahar butler, as discussed by Ambedkar in his writings, simply failed to capture the essence of the majority of the Shudra population in India. At the core of Ambedkar's ideology was a strong antipathy to both Hinduism and to Brahmins. As Jacob de Rouwer writes in his brilliant essay, Ambedkar was wrong about Hinduism, and I'll quote what he's written. Ambedkar's basic message was that A, Indian society is dominated by an all pervading religion named Hinduism. This is a bad and wrong religion which has no universal spiritual principles. Its evil Brahmin priests are responsible for inventing its multitude of commands and prohibitions. D, the caste system has its sacred foundations in Hinduism. E, this Hindu system prevents a true nation and society from coming into being in India. To annihilate caste, one would have to, of course, destroy its foundations, the religion that has produced it. Consequently, the annihilation of caste entailed the annihilation of Hinduism. This is what Ambedkar stood for. He echoed such utterances as though they constituted a rational and moral analysis of a culture. In reality, they were discarded scraps of an old Christian theology of false religion, now presented as facts about the world. If our Colossus had even an inkling of the Protestant Christian framework which produced the judgments that he reproduced, he could have spared himself the effort and summed up his harangue in just one simple sentence: Hinduism is false religion and it needs to disappear. Jacob de Rover ends his essay by saying, to promote the annihilation of a culture and its traditions without any understanding is one of the worst things one can do to humanity. Our cultures and our roots are all that we have to save us from the loss of bearings that is overtaking the contemporary world. For India, the rediscovery of its cultural resources will be essential to its future survival. Yet, instead of taking this seriously, the country is witness to the rising celebration of a quote unquote thinker whose thought stands diametrically opposed to his endeavor. If there is one piece of evidence that establishes the intellectual and ethical bankruptcy of India's ideologues on all sides of the political spectrum, it must be their glorification of Ambedkar's thought. I end this quote. So, when India was about to become independent, Ambedkar appealed to Gandhi through Babu Jagjeevan Ram to be included in the new government. Despite Ambedkar's strong opposition to the independence movement and his criticism of Gandhi and other Congress leaders, he was offered a position in the cabinet after independence, which he accepted. The Congress extended an olive branch by offering him the post of law minister. But Ambedkar never publicly acknowledged this gesture. Ambedkar was appointed as the president of the drafting committee of the Constitution, leading to a misconception that he was solely responsible for drafting the Constitution. But this is a myth. This overlooks the collaborative effort involving many intellectuals and leaders. The Constitution of India borrowed heavily from the Government of India Act of 1935, and Ambedkar himself acknowledged that he was not the sole author but merely a contributor to the Constitution. While he played a significant role, attributing sole authorship to him is a myth of post-independent India. Ambedkar had actually opposed the Constituent Assembly until independence and advocated for a commission of lawyers from the US or Britain to handle constitutional matters in India. He believed that the provincial assemblies lacked the capability to deal with such complex issues. Ambedkar even went as far as to declare that granting independence to India would be the greatest disaster. In fact, in a parliamentary session in 1953, Ambedkar himself voiced his disapproval for the Constitution, stating, people often say to me, oh, you are the architect of the Constitution. My answer is that I was a hack. What I was asked to do, I did, much against my will. He further remarked, I am quite prepared to say that I shall be the first person to burn it out. I do not want it. It does not suit anybody. Nonetheless, Ambedkar's stance on caste in the Constituent Assembly can be dissected into two primary themes. Firstly, he grappled with the idea that the level of protection afforded to lower caste groups was inherently tied to their voting rights. This variability in approach stemmed from the complexities arising from pre-independence voting restrictions, which posed challenges in effectively representing these marginalized communities. Secondly, Ambedkar firmly believed that any constitutional framework must directly address the issue of caste. He argued that silence on this matter would be untenable, necessitating thorough confrontation of caste dynamics within the Constituent Assembly. Central to this discussion was the recognition that caste presented a unique challenge distinct from that posed by religion. While religious freedom aimed to decouple citizenship from faith, the objective with caste was not mere accommodation, but rather, as Ambedkar asserted, complete annihilation of caste. So the Constituent Assembly faced a significant dilemma. Ignoring caste would leave individuals vulnerable to the dominance of caste groups in society. However, recognizing caste risked further entrenching it as an identity. To navigate this, the assembly turned to abstraction, establishing the concept of quote unquote backwardness as a means of identifying groups. While theoretically applicable to any group, it was initially applied to the lower caste groups of India. The constitution aimed not to provide specific groups, protect specific groups, but to liberate individuals from domination. Special treatment for caste was a result of this broader principle. So the concept of backwardness provided a rationale for treating certain groups differently. Ambedkar advocated for the use of quotas, arguing that they could be justified for both included and excluded groups. Since backwardness was relative, quota were to be limited to a minority of seats. So this answers the question that I asked at the beginning of the talk. Where does this concept of backwardness comes from? It comes from the Constituent Assembly and from what Ambedkar wanted at that time. The concept of backwardness provided a rationale for treating certain groups differently. Ambedkar advocated for the use of quotas, as I said. So the 1950 Constitution of India, aside from banning untouchability, it included the reservation system, a means of positive discrimination, as it's called, that created the classification of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Communities that were categorized as being one of those groups were guaranteed a percentage of the seats in the national and state legislatures, as well as in government jobs and places of education. The Indian Constitution Order 1950 listed 1,108 castes across 25 states in its first schedule as scheduled castes and lists 744 tribes across 22 states as scheduled tribes. People belonging to SC communities were spread all over the country, with 80% of them living in rural areas. The Constitution incorporated various provisions for the socio-economic development of these groups. For instance, Article 371 for SCs, Article 341 for SCs, 342 for STs, and Article 340 for other backward classes. Also, to improve the socio-economic condition of SCs and STs, the Constitution provided a framework for a three-pronged strategy. The first prong was protective arrangements, such measures as are required to enforce equality, to provide punitive measures for transgressions, to eliminate established practices that perpetuate inequities, and so on. So a number of laws were enacted to operationalize the provisions in the Constitution. Examples would include Untouchability Practices Act of 1955, the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989, which we'll hear about more, the Employment of Manual Scavengers and Construction of Dry Latrines Prohibition Act of 1993, etc. The second prong of the strategy was reservation, to provide positive preferential treatment in allotment of jobs and access to higher education as a means to accelerate the integration of SCs and STs with mainstream society. The third was development, provide for resources and benefits to SCs and STs to bridge the wide gap in social and economic conditions between them and other communities. So the Constituent Assembly essentially entrenched the Risleyan Revolution as a third rail of Indian politics in independent India that simply cannot be questioned. This was not the only approach that India could have taken. There were other proposals on the table. So what you see here is a quote from Veer Savarkar in 1943, when he led the All India Hindu Mahasabha. He said, Hindu Mahasabha is always willing to extend its hand of cooperation to all those who accept the four principles, namely territorial integrity of India, majority rule in provinces and the center, residuary powers in the center, and recruitment to public service on merit alone. In 1944, the All India Hindu Mahasabha adopted the Constitution of the Hindustan Free State as a possible draft constitution written by D.V. Gokhale, Lakshman Bopatkar, K.V. Kelkar, and M.R. Dharmadare, with a foreword by N.C. Kelkar. The ideas in this constitution were directly linked to Savarkar's speech at the Mahasabha session in Calcutta in 1939, where he outlined his views on the future constitution of India. So you can see here what the rights are that are given. The Constitution granted equal rights under the law for all citizens. It prohibited discriminatory laws. It guaranteed admission to educational institutions without making any caste distinctions. It guaranteed freedom of expression and freedom of association. So this constitution, Savarkar, it was built on Savarkar's views. Savarkar was strictly against the caste system, and in his 1931 essay titled Seven Shackles of the Hindu Society, he wrote, and I quote, one of the most important components of such injunctions of the past that we have blindly carried on and which deserves to be thrown in the dustbins of history is the rigid caste system. Savarkar said, once the children are educated together, they will not observe caste hierarchy in later life. They will not feel the need to observe caste division. In addition, the government should abandon the title Special Schools for Low Caste Children. This very title creates a feeling of inferiority among children attending the school. There were other leaders in that era who advocated a different approach to the one the Constituent Assembly took as well. Damodar Swarup Seth, a Constituent Assembly member from United Provinces, now Uttar Pradesh, was a staunch socialist. He was an outspoken defender of the rights of people from the economically and socially lower strata of society, but he opposed the idea of reservation as the solution to uplift them and was against the proposed reservation for so-called backward classes. The very term was problematic to him, as he said that there could be no easy way to define it. He feared reservation in services for backward classes would lead to casteism and favoritism and threaten the secular fabric of this country. For him, merit and qualification were the best determinants of the suitability of a candidate. Some opponents of reservation said that Ambedkar's participation in the assembly as the law minister and chairman of the drafting committee was itself a strong indication that the country had advanced and does not need reservation. K.M. Munshi asserted in the Constituent Assembly that the scheduled castes were not minorities in the way that minorities are defined under international law. He said the minorities, so far as international treaties and international law is concerned, is only restricted to racial, linguistic, and religious minorities. The Harijans, generally known as scheduled castes, are neither a racial minority nor a linguistic minority, not certainly a religious minority. At one stage, Sardar Patel and Munshi tried to convince Ambedkar to give up his insistence on reservation. Ambedkar remained steadfast in his stance. He even offered to resign from both his seat in the Constituent Assembly and his position as law minister. However, Nehru and Patel refrained from pressing the issue further. Patel viewed the so-called untouchables as indistinguishable from the rest of Hindu society. During Constituent Assembly debates, he remarked, "There is no scheduled caste between us." He urged scheduled caste representatives to shed their inferiority complex and integrate fully into society. In practice, Patel followed his beliefs. At the Convention for the Eradication of Untouchability in Vadwan, he joined scheduled caste delegates who were seated separately. Patel successfully persuaded Muslims, Christians, and Parsis forego claims for reservation for their communities. He failed to persuade Ambedkar on reservation. The issue of reservation soon underwent judicial scrutiny. The state of Madras versus Srimati Champakam Dorairajan case in 1951 was the first major verdict of the Supreme Court on the issue of reservation. In its ruling, the Supreme Court upheld the Madras High Court judgment, which had in turn struck down the government order passed in 1927 in the Madras Presidency. The government order had provided caste-based reservation in government jobs and college seats. The Supreme Court's verdict held that providing such reservation violated Article 29(2) of the Indian Constitution, according to which no citizen shall be denied admission into any educational institution maintained by the state or receiving aid out of state funds on grounds only of religion, caste, race, language, or any of them. The case led to the First Amendment in the Constitution, which clarified that the right to equality does not bar enactment of laws which provide, quote unquote, special consideration for weaker sections of society. In January 1953, Prime Minister Nehru appointed Kaka Kalelkar to lead the first Backward Classes Commission, signaling a distinct approach to addressing backward classes separate from scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. Despite this, Kalelkar's allegiance to the Gandhian ideology rather than Ambedkar's was evident from the outset. He submitted the commission's report in 1955, reflecting his admiration for Gandhi's vision. In his report, Kalelkar acknowledged that he, quote, was not blind to the good intentions and wisdom of our ancestors who built the caste structure, unquote. His dedication to Gandhi's philosophy of a united India free from caste discrimination was evident throughout his career. Kalelkar wrote in his report that prejudice doesn't hold a community back educationally or economically. If backward communities have neglected education, he wrote, it is because they had no use for it. Now they have discovered their mistake. It is for them to make necessary efforts for their prosperity. They will naturally receive whatever help is available to all citizens, he concluded. In a letter in the report, he wrote, I am definitely against reservation in government services for any community for the simple reason that services are not meant to be meant for the servants. They are meant for the service of the society as a whole. The next important committee to be set up was a Lokur Committee, or the Advisory Committee on the Revision of Lists of Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes. The term scheduled tribes had been introduced in the Indian Constitution, but the document did not specify the criteria for identifying these tribes. According to Article 366(25), scheduled tribes are defined as tribes or tribal communities designated under Article 342 of the Constitution. Article 342 only outlined the procedure for specifying scheduled tribes. Initially, after independence, the classification of scheduled tribes relied on the definition from the 1931 census. This census categorized scheduled tribes as quote unquote backward tribes residing in quote unquote excluded and partially excluded areas. In response to this, the government of India established the Lokur Committee in 1956. One of the committee's objectives was to review and update the lists of scheduled castes and scheduled tribes using a scientific and rational approach. And what they came up with is very interesting. The Lokur Committee's report noted, and I quote, while we appreciate the necessity of providing special assistance for the uplift of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes until they rise to the average stratum of society, we regret to note that the listing of these castes and tribes has more or less created vested interests and has tended to damp to some extent personal effort and enterprise to improve one's position and fortune. Inclusion in the lists is regarded more as a coveted prize than as a reflection of backwardness. While a large number of requests for inclusion in the lists were pressed before us, we had only one instance of a request for exclusion from the lists on the ground that inclusion in the lists operates as a stigma. The Constitution does not provide for the total liquidation of these lists at any time. But prominent social workers, political leaders outside the fold of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, and a large number of officials whom we met in the course of our inquiry asserted that in the interest of national integration and in view of the changes which have taken place during the last 15 years, the time has come to do away gradually with these privileged classes, particularly in view of increasing demand for inclusion and to organize developmental schemes without reference to tribes or castes. The least that should be done, we were told, is to fix a time limit for the currency of the lists. In any case, the consensus of opinion expressed before us has been that the emphasis should be on the gradual elimination of the larger and more advanced communities from these lists and on focusing greater attention on the really backward sections, preferably by applying an economic yardstick. End quote. Needless to say, the recommendation was not implemented. Then the incendiary Second Backward Classes Commission was appointed by the Janata Party in 1979, and it was led by B.P. Mandal. Mandal was an avowed Risleyan revolutionary. He believed that social backwardness was the direct consequence of caste status and used survey methods to conduct his research. Mandal, well versed in political and social issues from his youth, entered politics at the remarkable age of 23. Later, he made history by becoming one of the earliest chief ministers in India from a backward class, assuming office in Bihar in 1968. Mandal's influence was such that caste-based insults were prohibited in Bihar's assembly due to his efforts. In 1979, he put together a point system to assess backwardness and used data from the 1931 census to report that these so-called backward communities constituted about 52% of India's population. In his report submitted to the government under Indira Gandhi's leadership in 1980, Mandal acknowledged the potential discontent resulting from OBC reservation, stating, "It is certainly true that for OBCs, that reservation for OBCs will cause a lot of heartburn to others. Following the change in government from the Janata Party, the report remained shelved for a decade." Mandal passed away in 1982 before he could present and elaborate on his report in Parliament. Despite being tabled and debated, the Congress dismissed the report in 1982 and 1983, consigning it to oblivion for the time being. A 1990 study by the National Commission for SCs and STs highlighted various causes of atrocities against scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, including land disputes, bonded labor, and caste prejudice. The post-independence era saw numerous atrocities, such as the assassination of scheduled caste leader Emmanuel Shekharan, Pirvenmani massacre in Tamil Nadu, and killings in Andhra Pradesh. Pressure from scheduled caste MPs led the government to monitor such incidents from 1974 for scheduled castes and 1981 for scheduled tribes. Despite this, atrocities continued to rise, with incidents like massacres in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh and police killings in Madhya Pradesh. To combat atrocities against scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, the Parliament of India enacted the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Act of 1989, commonly known as the SC/ST Act. The act was passed on 11th September 1989 and officially notified on 30th January 1990. It underwent significant amendments in 2015, 2018, and 2019 to strengthen its provisions. The provision under Section 3(1)(x) of the SC/ST Prevention of Atrocities Act 1989 aimed at preventing intentional insults or intimidation with the intent to humiliate members of scheduled castes or scheduled tribes. This provision is rife for potential misuse. Data indicates that a significant percentage of cases filed under this section turn out to be false, leading to concerns about innocent individuals being wrongfully framed. In a democracy like India, individual rights should ideally take precedence over group sentiments. However, the prevalence of draconian legal provisions that often prioritize group identities over individual rights perpetuate prejudice and hinder societal cohesion. The Supreme Court announced a decision in 2018 to limit automatic arrests under the SC/ST Act. This was aimed at safeguarding the rights of the accused without infringing upon the rights of SC/ST communities. But concerns about the potential misuse of the Act persist, prompting calls for reforms such as stringent action against those filing false complaints and periodical reviews of the communities included in the Act. Following public outcry about the Supreme Court's judgment from SC/ST communities, Parliament passed the Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes Prevention of Atrocities Amendment Bill in 2018 to overturn the Supreme Court's decision. The amendment seeks to expedite the registration of FIRs and ensure timely justice for victims of atrocities against SC/STs, despite criticisms of potential adverse effects on individual rights. It made the law even more draconian than it was before. These amendments to the SC/ST Act have raised concerns about infringement of fundamental rights. The Act has become a tool for blackmail, with individual citizens who are innocent and public servants being targeted. It lacks safeguards against false complaints and undue harassment, leading to arrests without proper scrutiny. The Supreme Court's ruling to limit anticipatory bail and preliminary inquiries into the Act has further exacerbated these concerns. While the Act aims to protect the rights of SC/ST communities, its implementation has often resulted in injustice and discrimination against individuals from other communities. The amendments to the Act have been criticized for violating the fundamental rights guaranteed by the Constitution, particularly Article 21, which ensures the right to life and personal liberty. The indiscriminate arrests under the Act have led to grave consequences for the accused and their families without adequate provision for proving innocence or seeking redress for false allegations. Commissioner Risley would have been proud. The revolution, of course, rolls on. In addition to all this, the first Commission for Scheduled Castes and Scheduled Tribes was formed in August 1978 with Bola Paswan Shastri serving as its chairman. Subsequent commissions were constituted in 1992, 95, 98, and 2002. The National Commission for Scheduled Castes now operates as a constitutional body under the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, Government of India. Its primary mandate is to safeguard the interests of scheduled castes and Anglo-Indian communities as outlined in the Constitution. Article 338 of the Indian Constitution establishes the NCSC, while Article 338A of the Indian Constitution establishes the National Commission for Scheduled Tribes. Under the umbrella of the NCSC, first commission was established in 2004 with Suraj Bhan as the chairman. Successive commissions followed in 2007, 2010, 2013, and 2017, each working towards the protection and advancement of scheduled castes. The functions of the NCSC are broad-ranging. It encompasses the investigation and monitoring of matters related to safeguards for SCs. It involves inquiries into specific complaints regarding rights deprivation. It involves participating in socio-economic development planning, submitting reports to the president on safeguard implementation, making recommendations for effective safeguard recommendation, and other measures for the welfare of scheduled castes, and discharging other functions specified by the president subject to parliamentary law. Then there was also action at the state level. The Union government gave the states the liberty to choose their own criteria to define backwardness in 1961 and create their own OBC lists. After this, several state governments set up commissions and began to set aside reserved categories in jobs and educational institutions, and have successfully been able to revise and update their lists of backward classes. Prior to 1971, Tamil Nadu's reservation quota was 41%. After M. Karunanidhi became chief minister, succeeding Annadurai in 1969, he established the Sattanathan Commission to address the welfare of backward classes. Following the commission's recommendations, Karunanidhi increased reservation for backward classes from 25% to 31%, and for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes from 16% to 18%, raising the total reservation to 49%. In 1980, under AIADMK's M.G. Ramachandran, reservation for backward classes was further elevated to 50%, expanding Tamil Nadu's total reservation to 68%. This decision came after AIADMK's defeat in the 1980 Lok Sabha elections, which was partially attributed to their introduction of an economic criterion for reservation eligibility. MGR chose to eliminate the creamy layer and raise the reservation for backward classes. In 1989, during DMK's governance, Chief Minister Karunanidhi introduced the most backward classes category, incorporating castes like Vanyars within this segment. The MBC quota, constituting 20% within the 50% BC reservation, was established. Subsequently, based on a Madras High Court ruling in 1990, Karunanidhi segregated reservation for SCs and STs, allocating a 1% quota for STs, thus increasing Tamil Nadu's overall share of reservation to 69%. In 1991, Mandal's report experienced a resurgence. The then Prime Minister VP Singh introduced the report on 7th August 1990 as part of his commitment to social reform during Ambedkar's centenary year, which he designated as the quote-unquote year of social justice. However, he was reportedly convinced that implementing the report would checkmate his political rival, his former Deputy Prime Minister Devi Lal, who had left his post on 31st July. Addressing the Rajya Sabha on August 9th, Singh acknowledged the anticipated resistance to structural changes. When defending the Mandal report, Singh could say that Brahmins have to do penance for the centuries of oppression which they have inflicted on the backwards, without anyone questioning his historical assumptions, because communist historians and sociologists have been fortifying anti Brahminism by rewriting history in India as a perennial struggle between Brahmin oppressors and the rest. Anti Brahminism is now part of the official doctrine of the secular Socialist Republic of India. However, the response to the report was polarizing. Opposition leader Rajiv Gandhi condemned VP Singh, calling him the most divisive man after Muhammad Ali Jinnah, while Mayawati criticized the hasty implementation of the report. Nonetheless, 27% of public sector jobs and educational seats were reserved for OBCs based on Mandal's projection of OBCs constituting 52% of the population. That decision triggered a chain of events. Widespread protests broke out. Delhi University student Rajiv Goswami self-immolated to protest its implementation. And the fragile VP Singh government fell apart. Cities shut down across the country as protests led to burned government buildings, suicide attempts, and disruption of road and rail traffic. In Lucknow, unreserved caste medical students protested by polishing shoes in an attempt to demonstrate their fate if reservation were implemented. Even the media was divided. Video magazine News Track was anti-Mandal, and journalist Madhu Trehan said, VP Singh has the blood of students on his hands. The Indian Express ran editorials urging unreserved caste students continue protesting. India Today ran an anti-reservation cartoon. VP Singh stood grinning with reserved communities on a ship, while unreserved caste students drowned holding their merit certificate. Unreserved caste students drowned holding their merit certificates. It also published an opinion denouncing Rajiv Gandhi's cynical waffling. So, to understand the flaws in this report and its implementation, I will quote from Rajiv Gandhi's objection in Parliament to the implementation of this report, and this is a good speech. So he said, there are many questions about the Mandal Commission report itself. There are many contradictions in the Mandal Commission report, and I would like just at random to point out some in this house. Let me first go to what the Mandal report says about the Kaka Sahib Kalelkar Commission in para 1.9. When the Kaka Sahib Kalelkar report was presented to the government said, and I quote, in view of the above, the government considers it necessary. Some positive and workable criteria should be devised for the specification of the socially and economically backward classes. One important reason as to why the central government could not accept the recommendations of the Kaka Sahib Kalelkar was that it had not worked out objective tests and criteria for the proper classification of socially and educationally backward classes. In several petitions filed against reservation orders, including state governments, the Supreme Court and various high courts have also emphasized the imperative need for an empirical approach to defining socially and educationally backwardness and identification of other backward classes. Did the Mandal Commission give solid scientific foundations to the Commission's findings? It is a big question. Sir, three important sociologists were involved with the Mandal Commission: Professor B.K. Roy Burman, Professor Srinivasan, and Professor Jogendra Singh. They have been thanked in the preface of the Mandal Commission report for the work they have done. But reading the newspapers recently, I found out they have declined the honor, and they have clearly said they were denied any real opportunity to participate in the findings. I will repeat. The task of this team was solely to drop a plan of studies, not to do the studies only, but to drop a plan of studies. They did not do the studies. This group was never consulted again. Then the Srinivas panel did only meet for 5 days. So the research team met for 3 days. The Srinivas panel met for 5 days. This committee never met again and was never consulted again. What I'm trying to point out is not that this report is worthless and should be thrown away. Like I said, there is substance in this report, but to say that you will just accept it like that without discussing it or without debating it is not adequate. It needs more looking into. Paragraph 3.15 says, on the basis of 1891 and 1931 census, data was collected and analyzed with a view to getting a frame for the linkage of traditional occupations by caste. We are talking about data which is 100 years old or 60 years old. Can we really interpolate from 1891 and 1931 to 1990, or something better needs to be done? Commission thought it was inadequate, and he himself said He relied on three methods because this data collection was not good enough. So he rejected that at the beginning. Generally speaking, it was seen that the views of every individual, this is the response of individuals, the views of every individual group and association were conditioned by their own class interests, and the question of giving concessions to OBCs was surcharged with emotion. That means the input that he has got from individuals and associations has been very biased by the people who presented them. He then goes on to say, it was but natural that most of the respondents appearing before the commission belong to the OBC. That means that the inputs that he has got are not a reliable cross section of society. Coming back to the socio-educational survey, he says the results are exhaustively listed and reported in Chapter 11. But these surveys, the village surveys, were only 810. Do such a small sampling check is a valid step when you are checking the validity of a report. But is it a valid step on which to base a complete report like this? It is not only that. The expert panel recommendation of the survey was that that was to be done was unilaterally rejected and changed, arbitrarily changed by the commission. He says this in para 11.10 and 11.15. Sir, the survey was conducted by junior government officials without any supervision or checking or validation by any high ranking or known sociologist. This is the data basis of the data that we have got. The next very important point is on what basis has the Mandal Commission defined caste in its definition? How has the Mandal Commission reinterpreted the constitution and changed backward classes to backward caste in para 10.4? Nearly 78% of the respondents were of the view that caste should be accepted as a criterion. However, 28% favored that acceptance of caste um, as sole criterion. Only 28% of the respondents favored caste as a sole criterion. 78% said that caste can be one of the criteria, but not the sole criterion. And then he himself goes on to say nearly 70% were in favor of evolving multiple criteria based on social status, political influences, educational attainments, economic level, employment status, etc. Others favored the including of place of habitation and financial position. I would like to link this to an earlier quotation that I made where the commission has said that most of the respondents were OBCs. So most of the respondents who were OBCs have said they do not want caste as the single definer. Sir, on what basis then has this government and the Mandal Commission accepted caste as the sole definer? Then again, there has been a methodology in collecting information. I won't go into the quotations because obviously they are going to go over their heads now. But again, the same thing. He has used four sources. One in himself. He has quoted the socio-educational field survey. What was the socio-educational field survey? Where was the scientific basis for this? He himself has described. His second item is the census report of 1961. What has the census report given us? He himself says, census report particularly for the identification of primitive tribes, aboriginal tribes, forest tribes, and indigenous tribes. The third is his personal knowledge after visiting 37 villages. 37 villages and his personal knowledge give us this information. The fourth source is list of OBCs as prepared by various states. Let me ask you a specific question. You must have at least read the recommendations chapter, if not anything else. Then I ask you specific questions on the recommendations. Sir, the commission has recommended specifically electorates based on caste. Commission has recommended in para 13.37.4, which says, with a view to giving better representation to certain backward sections of OBCs like the Gaddis in Himachal Pradesh, the Neo-Buddhists in Maharashtra, the fishermen in the coastal areas, the Gujars in Jammu and Kashmir, it is recommended that areas of their concentration may be carved out into separate constituencies at the time of delimitation. Does the government subscribe to the Mandal Commission view that political constituencies should be carved out on a caste basis? Are we going back to the roundtable conference for having separate electorates? That was designed to break our country. Then the commission goes and has the caste as the sole identifier. Why are we sitting here accepting caste as a sole identifier? Do we not have a responsibility over and above what is written in this book? Do we not have to react? Is it not our responsibility sitting in this house to see that the nation is not divided because someone may have made a slip up? Why are we here? Otherwise, they could sit there and such reports could be mandatory. Then the commission says that the information supplied was very incomplete. What sort of information is this report based on? What is the substance of this? How can we just accept that as a fact and just bulldoze it through the nation? We have to be more responsible than that. To switch over from class to the definition of caste as the definition, the commission quotes 3 Supreme Court judgments, but in the very report itself, there are at least 3 more Supreme Court judgments which says that you cannot define class only on the basis of castes. The commission itself says that caste cannot be the only factor. The Supreme Court says that caste cannot be the only factor, and if it is so, it will be struck down. But here we are happily sitting over here, representatives, 500 of us. We are happily saying that yes, caste can be a factor and caste must be the only factor. It is incredible that the government has no comment at all on this report. We have serious problems with certain definitions. We have problems if the weakest among the classes are not helped, and if the weakest among the minority religions are not helped. We have problems if caste is defined to enshrine casteism in this country. We have problems if casteism is going to be made a factor for parliamentary and assembly constituencies. The Congress cannot stand by and watch this nation being divided over the political convenience of one individual. Before deciding on the action of a report which leaves so many questions, we may agree with many things, but there are things we disagree with. It would have been prudent on the part of the government if it had at least called all those friendly parties. We would have liked if they had called us also. At least if they had called their friendly parties and had a thorough discussion, I'm sure such lacunas would have been closed. But unfortunately, without thinking about it, perhaps without even looking at the report, reading the report, you looked only at your manifesto, which has 10 words about it, and dived into it. Why did the government not go into all these things much more seriously? Was the unity and integrity of the nation not important to this government? Is it not important for you that children are getting killed in the street? Is it not important that caste violence is breaking out all over the country? Out of the report, out of a holistic picture that Mr. Mandal has put, I have picked up lots of holes in how he has come to his conclusion. But in his conclusion, there are a lot of things which should be, which are prudent, which should be done. Question is, have you done what Mr. Mandal wanted you to do? Have you taken his holistic picture, or have you taken just one part of that for political convenience? Thus, Mr. Mandal, in his report, consider any part of his recommendations more important than the other. Has he given a priority to it? On what basis have you given a priority to it? In fact, if I can quote from Mr. Mandal himself on what he thinks about his recommendations, he says that reservations in government employment, which is the only thing that you have done, the reservation in government employment and educational institutions, as also all possible financial institutions, assistance are needed. He has listed 3 types of assistance, out of which you have done only one. All this will remain palliative unless the problem of backwardness is tackled at the root. And then he goes on at great length on what should be done. But what did you do? You made it phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 totally arbitrarily. You have not even put a time limit on the phases. The manner in which you have implemented the Mandal Commission, to me, it is breaking up my country. Breakup of my country may not be important to you. We need a complete picture of what the government wants to do. Do you want reservation? For how many sections do you want reservation? Are representations going to be proportional to the population as Mr. Mandal has recommended? An issue like reservation cannot be treated in a piecemeal manner. We must look at the whole picture. You must see. The government must decide how many sections must get reservation, whether those sections are going to be part of the backward, the SEBCs, or whether those sections are going to be apart from the SEBCs. We must know clearly what proportion of seats is going to be kept open. Otherwise, we will not know what the final picture is going to become. We would like to suggest that the government present a white paper to this House, a white paper which will suggest first the government's attitude towards the many incongruities in this report and how to correct them. Secondly, how the implementation is to be done and the recommendations are to be implemented. Third, why is the total picture of reservation that they want and what proportion of are they willing to leave open? This is also important so that the complete picture is in front of the nation when such a decision can be taken. We will participate fully in any such debate, and I can assure you that such a national dialogue will reduce the tension that is taking place right across the country today. Sir, that brings me to why all this is happening. If I can quote from an article in the Independent, in the last sentence, he says, the PM says, it was purely a political strategy. He had to use that political strategy. And in the last part of the sentence, he says he was not foolish. Perhaps it got cancelled by implementing the first part of that sentence. Why is this thing being brought in such a rush? I do not know because we are not privy to certain things. But I believe that the implementation of the Mandal Commission report was not even part of the cabinet agenda on the day it was brought in. It was put on the table and it was passed in a hurry because something was happening outside that this thing needed to be done. What was happening outside? There was a rally taking place in Delhi. Why was it necessary to rush into this report? Because if that rally got the support of certain chief ministers, then there would be tremendous problems inside this house. So to protect himself against internal party wranglings, and I charge you with this, you have taken the country to the edge of caste wars. Sir, Raja Sahib's policies are not very different from what the Britishers were doing. It was the British who tried to divide our country on caste and religion, and today it is Raja Sahib sitting there who is trying to divide our country on caste and religion. Already you are taking this country towards religious electorates. Ministers are provoking caste wars, and Raja Sahib is quiet. Why is he not speaking now? Why is he not telling his ministers to control themselves? He cannot do this. Is he part of the provocation that is killing people outside? Sir, socially and economically and educationally backward classes need all the help. they can get, including reservation, and the Congress will support you in that. We would like that to be targeted to the poorest and the weakest in socially and educationally backward classes. Congress party has outlined this um, in the working committee's resolution on the 30th August this year. I would like to appeal to this house. Let us not have one man's obstinacy holding India hostage. Let that man's obstinacy not lead to children getting killed. Our children, Indian children, getting killed on the streets. Let that man's obstinacy not lead to caste war. Violence must end. I appeal to the whole house. I appeal to the patriotism and patriotic feelings of every member in this house, not to remain idle, not to remain quiet, and save this nation from the obstinacy of one person. And I end quote. So that was his speech. With that, the original principle of the Constitution had been completely reversed after several decades. Instead of aiming to create a society free from the constraints of caste, the trajectory of reservation has led to an expansion of beneficiaries and the grouping together of various groups with very different histories. This shift has resulted in neglecting the unique reasons for providing special treatment in different sectors and had carried the Constitution away from its original vision. India had transitioned from a framework that sought equality beyond caste to one where equality was pursued through caste-based claims. This shift represented a departure from the original vision, impacting not only the issue of caste, but also the broader concept of equality across various contexts in India's constitutional framework. Notch up another major win for Herbert Risley and the revolutionaries. A challenge to the implementation of reservation in government jobs based on caste in the context of the Mandal Commission report was it soon reached the Supreme Court. This was known as the Indra Sawhney case, also known as the Mandal case, which led to a landmark judgment delivered by the Supreme Court in 1992. In its ruling, the Supreme Court held that while reservation for socially and economically backward classes, educationally backward classes, were constitutionally permissible under Article 16(4), total reservation should not exceed 50% of available seats. This decision set a legal precedent for the extent to which reservation could be implemented in India. The concept of creamy layer also gained currency through this judgment. The court said that the creamy layer of OBCs should be excluded from the list of beneficiaries of reservation. There should not be, and that there should not be any reservation in promotions. The Parliament responded by enacting the 77th Constitutional Amendment Act, which introduced Article 16(4)(a). The article confers power on the state to reserve seats in favor of SCs and STs in promotions in public services if the communities are not adequately represented in public employment. The Supreme Court in M. Nagaraj versus Union of India 2006 case, while upholding the constitutional validity of Article 16(4)(a), held that any such reservation policy, in order to be constitutionally valid, shall satisfy the following three constitutional requirements. The SC and ST community should be socially and educationally backward. The SC and ST community are not adequately represented in public employment, and any such reservation policy shall not affect the overall efficiency in the administration. In Jarnail Singh versus Lakshmi Narayan Gupta case in 2018, Supreme Court held that reservation in promotions does not require the state to collect quantifiable data on the backwardness of the scheduled castes and scheduled tribes. The court held that creamy layer exclusion extends to SCs and STs, and hence the state cannot grant reservation in promotion to SCs, STs, individuals who belong to the creamy layer of their community. Despite the Indra Sawhney judgment, Tamil Nadu's government had a 69% reservation policy. And following the Madras High Court's order in 1993 to reduce reservation to 50% for the next academic year, the Tamil Nadu government filed an SLP in the Supreme Court. However, an interim order reiterated the 50% cap on reservation. Unable to secure relief from the courts, in November 1993, the Tamil Nadu Assembly passed a unanimous resolution urging the union government to amend the constitution. This aimed to allow the state to maintain its 68% reservation for backward classes' welfare. Subsequently, the Tamil Nadu government introduced the Tamil Nadu Backward Classes, Scheduled Castes, and Scheduled Tribes reservation of seats in educational institutions and of appointments or posts in the services under the State Bill 1993. Chief Minister J. Jayalalitha led a delegation to Delhi, seeking the union government's support and insisting on placing the act under the 9th schedule of the Constitution, shielded from legal challenges. On receiving the president's assent, the 69% reservation policy became law, safeguarded by inclusion in the 9th schedule. The Risleyan revolution keeps on winning. The states present several anomalies. Jats, for example, are listed as OBCs in Delhi, Rajasthan, Madhya Pradesh, Uttar Pradesh, and Uttarakhand, while in other states like Haryana, they are vying for OBC status. In 2015, the Supreme Court struck down the year-old move to include Jats in the central OBC list. Migration is yet another layer in this complicated negotiation for OBC identity. The NCBC says that if an OBC person migrates to a state where they are not listed as an OBC, they are not eligible for OBC benefits there. A National Commission for Backward Classes was set up in 1993 as an outcome of the Indira Sawhney judgment and became a constitutional body under the 102nd Constitutional Amendment in 2018. Tasked with addressing complaints and evaluating welfare measures for backward classes, the NCBC also maintains a central list of other backward classes, although it does not track population sizes. Despite discussions about introducing a caste column in the 2001 census, the idea was abandoned due to the violent opposition seen during the Mandal Commission period. The issue resurfaced in 2010 ahead of the 2011 census, with the Manmohan Singh government initially supporting the inclusion of a caste column. However, then Home Minister P. Chidambaram ultimately decided against it. Instead, the government opted for a separate socio-economic caste census, which concluded in 2015 under the Narendra Modi government. The SECC's initial findings, though submitted, were reportedly flawed and never made public. The appointed expert group, led by Arvind Panagria, faced challenges, with Panagria eventually leaving the country for an academic position abroad. The Modi government's latest initiative to enumerate and classify OBCs involves the Rohini Commission, established in 2017. Initially expected to submit its report in March 2018, the Commission sought several extensions. Then the Constitutional 103rd Amendment Act of 2019 introduced yet another significant change by offering a 10% reservation in government jobs and educational institutions for individuals classified as economically backward within the unreserved category. This amendment modifies Articles 15 and 16 of the Constitution, incorporating clauses that authorize the government to implement reservation policies based on economic backwardness. Notably, this 10% reservation for economically disadvantaged individuals is in addition to the existing 50% reservation limit. On 7th November 2022, Supreme Court of India, by a 3-2 verdict in Janhit Abhiyan versus Union of India, upheld the validity of the 103rd Constitutional Amendment and held that the 50% cap on quota is not inviolable, and that affirmative action on economic basis may go a long way in eradicating caste-based reservation. This constitutional amendment put the total reservation to 59.5% in central institutions. The next frontier for the Risleyan revolution is subcategorization within categories such as SC, ST, and OBC. Such moves raise legal questions, as previous attempts by states like Punjab, Bihar, and Tamil Nadu to enact laws for subcategorization have been challenged in court. The issue arose when Andhra Pradesh proposed subcategorization based on evidence of varying degrees of backwardness among SC communities. The Supreme Court, however, ruled in 2004 that only Parliament can determine SC and ST lists. Despite this, 2020 judgment suggests that states could decide on benefits within these lists, but this is also under review. The Union government previously considered legal avenues for subcategorization, with the Attorney General opining that it was possible with substantial evidence. However, the National Commissions for SCs and STs argued that a constitutional amendment was unnecessary, citing existing provisions for state-specific laws. The debate centers on whether subcategorization would address disparities effectively. Proponents argue that it would prioritize benefits for the most backward SC communities, while opponents suggest existing schemes should be enhanced to reach them. Legal experts stress the need for comprehensive data to support subcategorization, emphasizing the importance of a thorough caste census to inform policy decisions. After nearly 5 years since the commission was first formed, the long-awaited Rohini Commission also finally submitted its report on the subcategorization of other backward classes in India at the end of July 2023. The report's findings are yet to be made public, but the subcategorization of OBC has already been implemented on the state level in 11 states across India. This has yet to face judicial scrutiny at the highest court of the land. Recently, Rahul Gandhi and the Congress have been making promises such as Jitni Abadi Utna Hak slogan, advocating proportional representation in jobs based on caste. Rahul Gandhi has joined the long list of foot soldiers of the Risleyan revolution. He has suggested that the lack of a caste census is responsible for unemployment, implying that increasing reservation for OBCs after such a survey would address joblessness. However, this overlooks the fact that higher OBC job quotas would merely replace non-OBCs in government jobs, rather than creating new positions. The real issue lies in government prioritizing populism over job creation, with vast numbers of vacancies in the public sector remaining unfilled due to financial constraints caused by election-related giveaways. While a caste census might benefit OBCs, without curbing populist policies, overall job growth in the government sector will stagnate. But Rahul Gandhi is unperturbed. His proposal for a wealth redistribution in India, again symbolized by the slogan Jitni Abadi Utna Hak, echoes failed communist revolutionary experiments of leaders like Mao and Pol Pot. Despite lacking details, his plan raises concerns reminiscent of Mao's disastrous collectivization efforts in China and Pol Pot's brutal regime in Cambodia. Mao and Pol Pot had flawed strategies resulting in widespread suffering and loss of life. Mao's down to the country movement forcibly relocated millions, leading to famine and mass starvation, while Pol Pot's Khmer Rouge regime caused mass displacement and executed thousands in so called re education camps. These experiments in wealth redistribution led to immense human suffering, particularly among rural and urban poor populations, with lasting psychological and physical trauma for survivors. Despite eventual policy reversals in China and Cambodia, the scars of these regimes endure, highlighting the dangers of hasty and inconceived wealth redistribution schemes. Besides these, the Congress has voted to pass a constitutional amendment to raise the 50% cap on reservation on SC, STs, and OBCs. They vote that the reservation of 10% in jobs and educational institutions for EWS will be implemented for all castes and communities without discrimination. Perhaps the only step pending that would take the Risleyan revolution to new heights is mandating reservation in private sector education and employment. Congress has stopped just short of promising that, but they have promised to establish a new diversity commission that will measure, monitor, and promote diversity in public and private employment and education. In many countries, programs similar to India's caste-based reservation system are initially presented as temporary, time-bound, and limited in scope. However, history shows that once implemented, these programs tend to expand beyond the scope of their original intentions. The idea of temporarily addressing centuries-old social disadvantages through such programs is inherently contradictory. While achieving equality of opportunity within a defined time frame is feasible, completely eliminating unequal outcomes is not. Leaders often struggle to control both the duration and the scope of these policies, as well as their unintended consequences. The expansion of preferred groups to include new categories can lead to tensions within the hierarchy of the preferred group itself. Moreover, reservation policies can create perverse incentives, causing both preferred and non-preferred groups to slacken their work ethic. Preferred groups may become complacent, believing their efforts are futile, while non-preferred groups may feel neglected and seek opportunities abroad where such exclusions do not exist. Additionally, cooperation among colleagues may suffer unfairly when members of preferred groups are perceived as quota fillers, regardless of their individual capabilities. This can breed resentment among non-preferred group members, leading to social tensions disproportionate to the actual benefits received by preferred groups. Moreover, now the people in preferred groups, such as OBCs, greatly outnumber the original quote-unquote untouchable groups targeted for upliftment. The intended benefits often extend beyond the broader preferred groups to individuals who are relatively better off. For instance, in many states, Chamars, a subcaste, secure a significant portion of the SC quota slots. This trend underscores how, over generations, the benefits of reservation policies have been accessed by individuals who may not urgently require or merit such affirmative action measures. When confronted with distressing social disparities, our response should not exacerbate the situation. Often, socially disadvantaged students require assistance long before they even embark on their college journey, sometimes as early as a decade prior. However, there are inherent limitations to policies in remedying certain issues, such as parental literacy, access to books at home, and the value placed on education by parents compared to the income earned through the child's labor. Politicians are typically unwilling to wait decades to witness the impact of interventions on these underlying factors. Similarly, taxpayers are hesitant to acknowledge the need for increased funding through taxes to address these complementary expenses and invest in enhancing the home environment for these families and children. Ultimately, reservation policies are detrimental regardless of the severity of social disparities, as they foster perverse incentives and often fuel disproportionate social resentment relative to the actual benefits realized. These challenges have prompted several countries to prohibit the collection of data on race and ethnic origins, recognizing the potential negative impacts of reservation policies on social dynamics. Recognizing the existence of real grievances is crucial, and addressing them is essential for fostering a fair and inclusive society. However, it's equally important to ensure that these efforts do not inadvertently undermine social cohesion. In the context of India, preserving social cohesion among Hindus holds significant importance for our overall well being. It serves as a cornerstone of our cultural fabric, providing a sense of unity, belonging, and shared identity. It fosters mutual respect, understanding, and cooperation, essential for maintaining harmony and stability in society. When divisions arise within Hindu society, it weakens collective resilience, hinders progress, and creates fertile ground for conflict and unrest. Therefore, while addressing grievances and disparities within Hindu communities, it's imperative to do so in a manner that strengthens rather than undermines social cohesion. The Risleyan path does not build social cohesion. It only strips so-called marginalized groups of any sense of pride in their ancestors' achievements, depriving them of their history and heritage. It also fosters a sense of alienation from their religion and the society in which they reside. The victim mentality is detrimental because it fosters a sense of powerlessness and dependency, hindering personal growth and resilience. Further, it imposes collective guilt on so called oppressor groups, despite individuals bearing no personal responsibility for historical injustices, real or perceived. This collective guilt inhibits even them from feeling pride in their ancestors' achievements and accomplishments. Dividing society into victims and villains perpetuates animosity and polarization, hindering societal cohesion and cooperation. It overlooks individual agency and promotes an us versus them mindset, hindering understanding and empathy. This is not healthy for society. A merit based system that promotes fairness, rewards hard work and talent, and ensures that individuals are recognized and rewarded based on their abilities and achievements, rather than arbitrary factors like social status or background, would be a significant improvement over the status quo. We must always be very cautious with attempts at social engineering. They often fail because they oversimplify complex social issues and ignore individual autonomy, individual agency. They underestimate the unintended consequences of intervention. Societal norms and behaviors are deeply ingrained and resistant to change. It makes it very difficult to impose top down solutions that do not align with the values and preferences of the population. The Risleyan revolution path is not working. We need an alternative path. There is hope, though. The simple truth is that manipulation, once exposed, trust is lost. Without trust in the Risleyan narrative, compliance would diminish. And without sufficient compliance, the Risleyan politics of control cannot succeed. Our role is to uncover and uphold the truth, to dismantle the mechanisms of hatred and the deceitful politics of manipulation. We must erode undeserved trust in Risleyan narratives until they crumble. This task is not only possible, but already underway on a significant scale. Our duty is to nurture and spread the flame of truth far and wide. First step is to study how the Risleyans have succeeded in their revolution. The Risleyan activist bureaucrats had a simple set of goals: capture the culture of the government agencies, enforce their revolutionary orthodoxy with educational indoctrination and reservation, turn the government into a patronage machine for their revolutionary activism. They still use the same techniques of tactics of manipulation, accusations of casteism, evocations of guilt and prejudice, privilege, rituals of criticism and self-criticism to push out more traditional scholars and delegitimize traditional conceptions of knowledge. The Risleans have decided that discrimination does not have to be explicit or even conscious for it to be addressed by state policy, and that it is a sin committed not against individuals, but against classes of people, entitled to pursue class action remedies. The Risleyan regime does not temper popular sovereignty, it replaces it. Speech suppression, such as in the SC/ST Act, is the natural outcome of that Risleyan regime, which makes fighting discrimination a condition for the legitimacy of the state. Once discrimination is held to be a part of the unconscious of the nature of Hindus, there are no areas of Hindu life in which the state's vigilance is not called for. Several generations, they have waged an all out war against quote unquote Brahminical casteism. It has been treated as a heinous crime where due process is denied. Yet large disparities still persist. It therefore follows mental forces that produce the disparities must be far subtler than previously imagined. Maybe casteism survives in some mysterious form, even when no living individual is casteist. Maybe it's structural casteism. Maybe books written centuries ago with politically incorrect views about Varna influence entire classes of people to live up to quote unquote casteist stereotypes. Maybe an insensitive facial expression inflicts devastating harm, microaggressions. This kind of logic leads inexorably to witch hunts, cancellations, discrimination against the so called privileged classes, and pseudo intellectual grievance studies academic fields in an effort to root out the hidden casteism. The political philosopher Raymond Aron described ideology quite precisely as the synthesis of an interpretation of history and of a program of action towards a future predicted or hoped for. In this synthesis, a theory about the historical origins of real or alleged social ills is pressed into the service of an imagined future in which those ills will be cured. The theory is not to be judged solely or even primarily by its adequacy in describing the historical record as it presents itself as an informed and to an informed and inquiring mind. Rather, it is to be judged by the promised consequences of the program of action that it underwrites. Of course, ideological prophecy appearing in times of organic or manufactured crisis, when everything assumes an air of urgency, must be taken on faith. It follows that the ideological synthesis remains incomplete until the program of action is implemented. Marx famously claimed philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. Ideology's most horrific social experiments illustrate several points that also apply to the totalitarian light of contemporary Hindu life. First, while human beings naturally form social groups for common purposes, ideology assumes that organic associations cannot support a good society, which must be engineered from the top down. This assumption, which no ideological experimentation has ever sustained, makes up in arrogance what it lacks in humility. Second, ideology abjures persuasion, preferring what Hannah Arendt calls mute coercion. We see this today in the insistence that certain widely shared opinions that were uncontroversial even a few years ago are so morally illegitimate that they do not even deserve a hearing. We see it in the fact that those who publicly voice such opinions are commonly smeared, hounded, denied financial services, investigated, and fired, even by those who publicly claim to stand for the freedom of speech. Third, ideology always involves the scapegoating and purging of opponents. Today, these quasi religious rituals include the sanctification of so called victims and the metaphorical public crucifixion of oppressors. Those who are targeted by or resist the ideological program must, with the exception of a few penitents who are mercifully spared, be decisively defeated in battle with the forces of good. For only then will the earthly salvation of a just and harmonious society be achievable. In modern times, the template for use of violence in the name of highest political and moral ideals was established in the French Revolution. Marching under the banner of liberty, equality, and fraternity, the revolution took less than 5 years to move from the 1789 Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen to the terror of Robespierre and the genocidal destruction of the Vendée. The trajectory from utopian fervor to nihilistic bloodshed traversed over the past century in countries scattered across Europe, Asia, Africa, and Latin America is unsurprising. One could hardly expect a program of radical social transformation that demonizes its opponents to be free of bloodshed. We must never permit Hindu society to descend into similar horrifying violence. Ideology is a highly communicable social contagion that infects people who are morally immunocompromised. It always attracts sadists and those who lust for power, groups that always outnumber true believers. But it also exploits the universal human longing for social validation and fear of being cast out. These risk factors are exponentially amplified by the tribalizing social and news media feedback loops that now fill the vacuum left by the permanent moral order of Dharma. If the intellectual lineage of the Risleyan revolution is a in the intellectual lineage of the Risleyan revolution is a deliberate attempt to undermine institutions like faith, family, local community, self-reliance, etc. So the first step is to addressing this is to stop doing that. The bigger picture is that the great national political project should be to gain power and strip these ideologies from government policy, from government personnel, from government training, from government grant making. Relentlessly remove these ideologies from the structures and functions and policies of the government. After all revolutionary ideologies say that they deliberately say we want to shred social institutions to create instability so that they could be in a position where they could achieve their revolution. The Risleyans are no different. Secret to successful activism isn't muscle, but information. The one who can discover, shape, and distribute information has a great deal of power. Currency in our knowledge era is language, fact, image, and emotion. The secret to good activism is not mass, but leverage. We have to realize that the game is not to debate the epiphenomenon of ideology, but to relentlessly unearth, attack, and dislodge the broader structural phenomenon that underpins it. This means attacking it on moral, aesthetic, financial, legal, and bureaucratic grounds, in addition to the more straightforward style of intellectual debate. We must recruit, recapture, and replace existing leadership and narrative building institutions. We must produce knowledge and culture at a sufficient scale and standard to shift the balance of ideological power. Counter-revolutionary thought has to move into the mainstream. There are three branches of our government: executive, legislative, and judicial. We must look for angles in all three domains. There is a strand of thinking among some that the Indian Republic is hopelessly corrupted and that we must transcend it. I disagree. There is a lot of good in this country, and most of our institutions can be renewed, reformed, or abolished and replaced as necessary. Machiavelli writes that the Roman Republic was able to renew itself for centuries through the rule of good men and by returning to its beginnings. There's a spiritual longing in this country to renew the foundations of India, of Bharat. The animating spirit of the Risleyan philosophy is the rejection of all limits. The Risleyan revolutionaries simultaneously advocate for the destruction of prior norms and for the realization of utopia, which is why it has been so unstable. And so there is a desire to dissolve all prior identities and social structures and replace them with a normless and completely plastic conception of Indian identity. This is untenable. Human beings have a specific fixed nature, which includes group affinities and tendencies towards certain paths of solace. There are inherent limits that cannot be surpassed through ideology. The Risleyan ideology will always lead to disappointment, and that's because the attempt to surpass human nature always ends in human destruction. But rather than adjust, the Risleyans always insist on flowing forward, rejecting criticism as another ism or phobia and redoubling their efforts. The same pattern applies to schools. The more extreme elements of Risleyan revolutionary theory are a good way to make children miserable, which to the minds of proponents only justifies a deeper intervention. It won't be stopped without a firm hand. It's a two-step process. First, set the preconditions, do the reporting, drive public opinion, prime the politicians. Next, take action, change the law, shift the incentive structure. The goal is to move towards a system of merit and equal treatment in state policy, that is, a rigorous and fair process that respects individual rights and treats people equally under the law. Many Indians do support this kind of system, but most politicians are still too fearful to take it on. It is up to us to shift the politics of the issue if we want to see good reforms in legislatures and the Supreme Court coming in the coming decades. The premise of this approach is that there are three lines of effort: the narrative line, which is emotion, the policy line, which is intellect, the action line, which is will. The successful activist hopes to drive all three lines to converge on a stated goal, in this case, abolishing all categorization by the government. In terms of principles, we need to employ our own moral language rather than allow ourselves to be confined by what is now euphemistically being called constitutional morality. We should be talking about and aiming at Purushartha, a common standard that challenges people of all backgrounds to achieve their potential. We must, above all, have courage, the fundamental virtue required in our time. Courage to stand and speak the truth. Courage to withstand character assassinations. Courage to face the mob. Courage to shrug off the scorn of the Risleyan revolutionary class. When enough of us overcome the fear that currently prevents so many from speaking out, the hold of the reservation regime will begin to slip. When courage begets courage, it's easy to stop a lone dissenter. It's much harder to stop 10, 20, 100,000, a million or more who stand up together for the principles of Dharma. Why would anyone embrace the risks that come with attempting to challenge the entrenched Risleyan regime? It is not for fame, revenge, or power. In order to realize the ultimate promise of the political, there must be something higher, a telos. For us, that telos must be the principle of Lokakshema, or global well-being, as articulated in the Mangala mantra, which I will chant now. Prajabhya swasti astu, mahisha mahin nyayen, margen paripalayantam, go brahmanebhyay nityam, shubham astu, samasta loka sukhino bhavantu, om shanti shanti. May there be well-being to the people. May the leaders rule this earth along the right path. May the cows and the knowers of the Vedas always be fortunate. May all the beings in all the worlds become happy. Om Shanti Shanti. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much, Deepak. I think with such topics, it is so easy to be emotionally and sentimentally charged. And it's so rare and difficult to find speakers who address such topics with impeccable research and on such an extensive and comprehensive degree as you have done. So, congratulations to you, and thank you for joining us today. It was very informative. It was, I think our readers will go ahead and then search for other matters, and we have learned so much that we did not really know all of these facts existed. So you've done great research, you've put in a lot of hard work, and thank you for delivering such a wonderful and informative talk for us today.